Welcome, dear listener. You've entered Audible Archives, a sanctuary of sound where lost tales awaken, your guide through these ancient echoes and timeless legends. So lean back, breathe deep, and let the story begin. This is Audible Archives, where every word holds a whisper of magic. Welcome back to Audible Archives. I'm Raul, your host and writer. In this second episode of the case files of Detective S.R.H, the shadows run deeper, the lies cut sharper, and the cost of truth grows heavier. From dragon-marked vengeance to haunted islands and long-buried sins, Detective S.R.H faces trials that test not just his mind, but his soul. These are Cases 6 to 10, and this is where the reckoning begins.
Case 6, The Dragon's Mark. It was early in the morning, the kind of cold, gray day that clung to your bones. Stephen Raul Hughes sat behind his desk in his dimly lit apartment, the thick smoke from his cigarette swirling lazily in the still air. The world outside seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for something, though Stephen wasn't sure what. His office was cluttered with case files, photographs, and half-finished reports. It had been weeks since he'd truly gotten any sleep, too many hours spent chasing Shadow's mysterious murders, missing people, forgotten crimes. Each case was a puzzle, but the pieces never quite fit together. He glanced at the clock. Another hour had passed, and still no new cases had come his way. The quiet had become suffocating. The kind of quiet that let the past slip in through the cracks. The ghost of his wife's laugh haunted him in moments like this, faint, like a melody that could almost be remembered, but always just out of reach. Sometimes, he swore he could hear it in the silence, but when he turned around, the room was always empty. A sharp knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts, and he looked up, surprised. Visitors were rare these days. "Come in," he called, his voice gruff from disuse. The door opened slowly, and a figure stepped inside. A woman, not tall but with a striking presence. She wore a long, heavy coat, though the apartment was warm enough for her to have left it at the door. Her pale face was framed by dark hair that cascaded in waves, and her eyes were sharp, piercing blue that seemed to be scanning every inch of the room, as if cataloging every detail. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, her voice measured, almost too calm. "I'm looking for Detective Hughes." Stephen raised an eyebrow. "You've found him." He leaned back in his chair, studying her. The woman held out a thin, weathered envelope, the edges frayed as though it had been handled too many times. The seal was unusual, an intricate design of a dragon, its form fierce and delicate at once, embossed in black wax. She didn't say a word, just handed it to him. Stephen took the envelope, his fingers brushing against her hand. She didn't flinch. It was a small detail, but one he would file away. He looked up at her, but she remained silent, watching him with those unnervingly sharp eyes. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice cool but tinged with curiosity. "Rebecca Haynes," she replied, her tone betraying nothing. "I was told you could help me." Stephen didn't reply immediately. Instead, he turned his attention back to the envelope. The wax seal had already been broken, and as he slid the letter out, the scent of something faintly metallic lingered in the air. Something older. Something dangerous. He unfolded the paper carefully, as if it might tear under the slightest pressure. The handwriting was elegant, deliberate, neat but hurried. He began to read aloud, his voice low, almost to himself. "Detective Hughes. Secrets buried in the ice can thaw the truth. Blackstone Manor. Midnight. Come alone. Stephen's lips pressed into a thin line as he finished reading. He didn't need to ask who had written it. The message was too pointed, too precise. The mention of secrets buried in the ice was the kind of phrase that felt like a key turning in his gut, unlocking something buried deep within him, a sense of danger, of unresolved questions. Blackstone Manor, he said finally, looking up at the woman. That's not exactly a place people invite others to. Rebecca nodded. That's why I've come to you. Her eyes didn't leave his. It's not a simple invitation, detective. It's a warning. There's something buried deep. I can't get to it alone. Not without someone who knows how to navigate the dark corners. Stephen's mind raced. Blackstone Manor. He'd heard the rumors, of course. The manor had been abandoned for years after its owner, Ezra Blackstone, disappeared without a trace. The property had fallen into disrepair, its sprawling grounds overtaken by weeds and the ravages of time. But it wasn't just the manor itself that piqued his interest. It was the people connected to it. Those who had come and gone, some disappearing, others simply fading into shadows. The house was a magnet for whispers, for strange happenings, and now it seemed it was calling him. I don't take kindly to being summoned like this, Stephen said, setting the letter down on the desk. He leaned forward, narrowing his eyes. But I'll admit, the mystery intrigues me. What's this really about, Miss Haynes? Rebecca's lips parted, and for the briefest moment, Stephen saw something flicker in her gaze, fear, perhaps, or something darker. But it was gone almost immediately, replaced by that same cold, calculated expression. My father, she began, her voice quiet but firm, was involved in something unspeakable. Before he disappeared, he uncovered something, a conspiracy. But he's not the only one who's gone missing. People close to the matter have been disappearing for years, leaving nothing behind but whispers. The police won't touch it, and neither will anyone else. You're my last hope. Stephen studied her for a long moment, his fingers tapping idly on the desk. And you think whatever's hidden in that house will provide the answers? Rebecca nodded again. It's a start. Stephen stood up slowly, his decision already made. He could feel the pull of the case, something deep in his gut telling him this was more than just another missing person or cold trail. There was something buried here, something tied to the darkness he had been chasing for years, something that could finally offer him the truth he had been seeking since his wife's death. He turned to Sebastian, who had been standing quietly by the door, watching the exchange with his usual calm demeanor. Get the car ready, Stephen said. We're going to Blackstone Manor. Rebecca gave a sharp nod. Midnight, she reminded him, her voice steady. Stephen glanced back at her, his mismatched eyes gleaming with a quiet resolve. I'm never one to keep an appointment waiting. As the woman left the room, Stephen's gaze lingered on the letter one last time. The dragon's image burned into his mind. There was no turning back now. The game had changed, and he was about to step into the heart of a mystery that might be far darker and far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. The car ride to Blackstone Manor felt longer than it should have. The city lights dimmed as the landscape changed, and the once familiar skyline faded into a series of dark, winding roads that led into the heart of nowhere. Stephen Raul Hughes sat in the back seat, his eyes fixed out the window, watching the shadows swallow the road ahead. Beside him, Sebastian Vale sat with a quiet intensity, as always, his posture stiff and alert. Stephen could feel the weight of the case already pressing on his shoulders. Rebecca Haynes had been silent for most of the journey. She sat in the front seat, her back straight, hands folded in her lap as if bracing herself for what lay ahead. The cold night air outside seemed to seep into the car, and Stephen wondered if it was her nerves or the atmosphere itself that made everything feel more oppressive than usual. Her eyes were still sharp, but there was an underlying tension there, a kind of quiet desperation. "What exactly are we walking into, Miss Haynes?" Stephen's voice broke the silence, low but direct. Rebecca didn't turn to face him immediately, instead staring straight ahead as the dark, twisted landscape stretched out before them. The manor was still some distance away, but its looming presence seemed to hang in the air, like a shadow waiting to swallow them whole. "I don't know everything," she said finally, her voice soft but unyielding. "I only know what my father told me before he disappeared. He'd been investigating a network in operation that ran much deeper than anyone realized. My family has ties to powerful people who've used their influence for more than just wealth. They've used it to control, to cover up things that should never have seen the light of day." Stephen raised an eyebrow. "And this conspiracy, is it tied to Blackstone Manor?" "Yes," she replied, her voice now firm. "My father was close to uncovering something buried beneath the manor itself. He always spoke of secrets buried in the ice. But I don't know what that means. All I know is that he never came back after he went there." Stephen let her words sink in. Secrets buried in the ice. It sounded like a metaphor, but Stephen knew better than to dismiss something so cryptic. In his line of work, even the most bizarre statements held meaning sometimes. They held the key to solving the case. "What about the people your father was working with?" he asked. "Do you have any idea who's behind this?" Rebecca paused before answering, her gaze drifting to the window as if searching for an answer in the dark. "It's hard to say. But I know my family's name has been dragged through the mud. They want to silence anyone who might expose them. And I think they know I'm getting close." Stephen leaned forward, studying her. "What makes you say that?" "There have been threats," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "And people who've disappeared. Not just my father. Others too, employees of the family, people who knew too much. I don't think this is just a business operation. It's something much darker." The car slowed, and the headlights caught a glimpse of the manor's silhouette in the distance, its sprawling, crumbling form rising against the night like a monument to decay. The air seemed to grow colder as they drew nearer, the oppressive silence growing heavier with each passing second. Sebastian spoke up from the front seat. "We're here." Stephen straightened in his seat, his hand instinctively brushing against the cold metal of his gun tucked inside his coat. He glanced at Rebecca, who was already looking ahead, her face drawn, a mix of determination and fear in her eyes. Blackstone Manor loomed in the distance, an imposing structure perched on a cliff overlooking the darkened valley below. The house was ancient, its stone walls weathered by decades of neglect, the once grand windows now dark, empty eyes. The iron gates creaked as they pushed open, their rusted hinges protesting the intrusion. The path to the front door was overgrown with weeds, and the gravel crunched under the wheels of the car, the sound piercing the otherwise quiet night. As they parked near the entrance, Stephen couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't the only ones who'd been summoned here tonight. Rebecca opened the car door slowly, her breath visible in the air, fogging up the glass as she stepped out. She glanced back at Stephen, her expression unreadable. "Please, don't trust anyone here." Not even me, she said, her voice trembling ever so slightly. Stephen nodded, his expression hardening. I never do. The three of them walked up to the front door, the shadows growing longer as they moved toward the entrance. The manor was silent, almost as if it were holding its breath, waiting. Stephen took a deep breath and pushed the door open, the ancient wood groaning in protest as it revealed the dark interior. The grand hallway was shrouded in darkness, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon through the broken windows. Dust hung in the air, and the smell of mildew and decay was thick. Yet, there was something else, a coldness, a presence that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. Stephen stepped inside, his eyes scanning the shadows. The house felt abandoned, yet he couldn't shake the sense that they weren't alone. Welcome, a voice called from the shadows, smooth and calm, as if waiting for them all along. Stephen's eyes narrowed. Who's there? A figure stepped from the darkness, a woman, tall and regal in appearance, dressed in a black velvet gown that shimmered even in the dim light. Her hair was dark, slicked back in a smooth, controlled style. She moved with the grace of someone who had spent years learning how to command a room. I'm glad you could join us, detective, she said, her voice calm, but there was something unsettling about the way she spoke. I've been expecting you. Stephen didn't move, but he studied her carefully. Who are you? My name is Helena Blackstone, she replied. And I have a story you need to hear. Helena Blackstone's presence was commanding, her figure emerging from the shadows of the manor's grand hallway like a ghost from another time. The dim light revealed little of her, but her posture alone spoke volumes, straight-backed, regal, and almost unnervingly calm. As she spoke, her voice carried an air of authority that seemed to fill the empty space around them, like a snake winding its way through a trap. I've been expecting you, Detective Hughes, Helena said, stepping forward into the faint moonlight that spilled through the broken windows. Her eyes, sharp and calculating, flicked briefly toward Rebecca before returning to Stephen. I imagine you have many questions. Stephen stood motionless for a moment, his senses on high alert. There was something off about her, too poised, too rehearsed. It wasn't just the eerie stillness of the manor or the coldness of the air, it was her presence. She seemed to know too much, and that never sat well with him. I'm not here for pleasantries, Stephen replied, his voice firm but laced with a thin edge of suspicion. I came because of your daughter's warning. Rebecca said her father was investigating something dangerous. Helena's lips curved into a slight, unreadable smile. Ah. So she did tell you about that. She paused, as if savoring the moment. You should know, detective, that Rebecca is, how should I put it? A bit too eager to dig into matters that were meant to stay buried. Stephen narrowed his eyes. He didn't trust this woman, something about her didn't feel right. But he had come this far, and the deeper he went into the manor, the more certain he became that whatever happened next would lead him closer to the answers he needed. I'll speak to Rebecca as I please, Stephen said, his gaze unwavering. What I want to know is what your family has been hiding. What did your husband or your father rather discover before he disappeared? Helena's eyes flickered for the briefest moment, but she quickly masked it with an unreadable expression. My father, she said slowly, was always looking for something. He was obsessed with the past, our family's past, and the legacy of Blackstone Manor. There's more to this house than meets the eye. Things were hidden away here long before I was born. Stephen could feel the tension growing thicker, the air colder with each passing second. He knew she was withholding information, But how much and why? Don't play games with me, Stephen said, his voice low, but sharp. You knew your father was onto something. What was it? What did he find? Helena took a step forward, her eyes flashing with something anger, perhaps, or frustration. What he found, she began, her voice tight, was something that could bring down everything we've built. The Blackstone family, our fortune, our influence, it all goes back to something far darker than you could ever imagine. Stephen stood silent for a moment, processing her words. He was close now, so close to whatever truth lay hidden in this decaying place. He could sense it, a dark undercurrent that tied everything together. But he needed more, and Helena wasn't going to give him answers easily. Darker than what? Stephen asked, his patience wearing thin. What could be so dangerous that your father, a man with such influence, would be willing to risk everything? Helena hesitated, her eyes dropping to the floor for a moment before she finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. My family was involved in something, not just a conspiracy, but something far more sinister. It started with a business deal, but it turned into a cover-up. And my father discovered it, right here in this manor. He uncovered records, documents, proof of illegal experiments, medical procedures conducted under the guise of legitimate research. And the people involved, people with connections that went all the way to the highest levels of power. They've been trying to bury the truth ever since. Stephen's heart skipped a beat. Illegal experiments? Medical procedures? The words rang a bell, but he couldn't place them just yet. But there was one thing he knew for sure. This wasn't just about a missing person or a series of strange disappearances. This was connected to something much larger, something deeply ingrained in the very fabric of the Blackstone family. And your father? Stephen asked, his voice barely a whisper now, as he processed the gravity of her words. What did he find that they were willing to kill for? Helena's eyes darkened, and for a brief moment, Stephen saw a flicker of pain in them. He found evidence of what was done here. The experiments, they were performed on people who didn't even know what was happening to them. They were a part of something monstrous. But my father got too close. He was going to expose everything. Her gaze shifted back to Rebecca, who had been standing quietly in the background, her face a mask of worry. And Rebecca, she's in danger too. They know she's trying to uncover what happened to her father. That's why they're watching her. Stephen turned to Rebecca, whose expression remained neutral, though the strain in her eyes was palpable. You didn't tell me everything, he said softly, but not accusingly. You knew your father was involved in something dangerous, didn't you? Rebecca nodded slowly. I knew he was investigating something. But I didn't understand how deep it went, or who he was really dealing with. Her voice cracked slightly, betraying her calm exterior. I never thought it would come to this. That my father, that he'd be taken, and that now I'm the one left to pick up the pieces. Stephen studied her for a long moment. She was caught in something much bigger than herself, much bigger than either of them had expected. But now, they had to find out exactly what had been hidden here at Blackstone Manor, and who was willing to do anything to keep it buried. Where do we begin? Stephen asked, turning his attention back to Helena. Helena's eyes were cold, calculating, as she looked back at him. There's a room beneath the manor. A hidden chamber. My father kept records, their documents, journals. It's where he discovered everything. But it's also where the danger is. Stephen's mind raced. A hidden room beneath the manor. This was what they had come for, the truth buried beneath layers of secrecy, of lies, and of a family desperate to protect its legacy. As the tension in the room thickened, Stephen couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just another case. It wasn't just about solving a mystery. This was personal. And he was about to walk deeper into a world where the line between good and evil, truth and lie, was razor thin. "We'll find it," he said finally, his voice firm. "And when we do, we'll expose the truth. But we have to move fast." Helena looked at him, and for the first time, a shadow of fear crossed her face. "I hope you're ready for what you'll find," she whispered. Stephen didn't reply. He didn't need to. He was already moving forward, deeper into the manor, into the unknown. He could feel it, the answers were waiting just beneath the surface. And they would come to light, no matter the cost. The hidden chamber beneath Blackstone Manor was not something easily found. For decades, it had remained concealed, forgotten by time and ignored by most of the Blackstone family. Even now, as Stephen descended into the depths of the manor, a sense of unease gnawed at him. Every step was a descent into darkness, not just physically but metaphorically. The walls seemed to close in around him, as though the very air was thick with the secrets buried beneath the estate. Helena led the way, her sharp gaze never leaving the path ahead. She moved with an unnerving confidence, like someone who had long ago reconciled with the things hidden in the dark corners of her life. Stephen trailed behind, his mind racing, piecing together the fragments of what they had uncovered so far. Illegal experiments, medical procedures, and a conspiracy that reached the highest echelons of power. Nothing about this case was what it seemed. Rebecca, her face pale with anxiety, walked closely behind. Despite the stoic exterior, Stephen could see the tremor in her hands as she gripped the lantern she held. She was afraid, and Stephen didn't blame her. Whoever or whatever had silenced her father was still watching, and now they had turned their eyes on her. As they reached a seemingly inconspicuous door at the far end of the hallway, Helena paused, placing her hand on the worn wood. Her fingers trembled just slightly before she pushed the door open with a forceful, almost angry motion. The room beyond was small but well kept. It appeared to be an old study, though it was unlike any study Stephen had ever encountered. The air was thick with the musty scent of old paper and leather-bound books. Shelves lined the walls, crammed with aged volumes and forgotten tomes. But it wasn't the books that drew Stephen's attention, it was the heavy oak desk at the far end of the room, its surface cluttered with stacks of papers, old photographs, and open files. "This is where it all began," Helena said quietly, her voice tinged with something like remorse. "My father kept everything here, his records, his journals. It's all a testament to his obsession with the truth. In his doom." Stephen stepped forward, surveying the desk with a practiced eye. There was an order to the chaos, a method to the madness that suggested someone had meticulously organized these papers at some point. Slowly, he began to sift through them, flipping past pages of disorganized notes and photographs that seemed to lead nowhere. And then, buried beneath a pile of old medical journals, he found something. A photograph tattered and faded, its edges worn with age. It depicted a young woman, her features obscured by shadows, but her eyes were hauntingly familiar. Something about the image sparked a memory, but Stephen couldn't quite place it. He studied the picture for a moment longer before sliding it into his coat pocket. Rebecca, who had been standing quietly by the door, finally stepped forward, her eyes locked on the desk. "That's my father's handwriting," she said softly, pointing to a series of notes scattered on the desk. He always wrote in a precise, methodical way. He never left anything to chance. Stephen picked up the notes, scanning through them quickly. There were detailed descriptions of individuals, medical procedures that seemed to blur the line between science and something far more sinister, and mentions of a hidden group and organization that had been operating beneath the surface for decades, infiltrating medical institutions and political circles alike. The names were all familiar high-ranking officials, powerful businessmen, and even people Stephen recognized from his own investigations. But the most unsettling part was the note at the bottom of the page, a single line written in bold, urgent strokes: "They know I'm close. It's only a matter of time before they silence me." Stephen felt a cold chill run down his spine. His fingers tightened around the papers as the weight of what they had uncovered settled in. Whatever had happened to Rebecca's father, whatever he had discovered, it wasn't just an isolated conspiracy. It was a web, one that stretched across the very institutions that govern society. And now, it seemed, they were drawing closer to Rebecca, just as they had drawn closer to her father. "There's more," Stephen said, his voice a low murmur. He turned to Helena. "What else are you hiding? What is this group after?" Helena's face tightened, her lips pressing into a thin line. She opened her mouth to speak but hesitated, as though weighing her next words carefully. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke. "They're after something far more dangerous than power or money. It's control, detective. Control of people, of minds, of bodies. My father was getting too close to uncovering what they were really doing, what they had been doing for years. The experiments, they weren't just medical procedures. They were attempts to control the very essence of human consciousness." Stephen's mind whirred as he absorbed the enormity of what Helena was saying. The idea of controlling human minds was a concept straight out of a dystopian novel, but here it was, laid bare in front of him. The power to manipulate thought, behavior, and even memory. No wonder her father had been killed, no wonder Rebecca was in danger. But there was something else, something that gnawed at the back of his mind. The photograph. The woman in it. It was as if the answer to all of this was right in front of him, just out of reach. "What else?" Stephen asked, his voice steady but with an underlying urgency. "What did your father uncover that connects this to the rest of the world?" Helena's face faltered, and for a brief moment, she seemed almost vulnerable. "He found something that no one was meant to find. There's a project, a long-running experiment under the guise of medical research. It involves altering the human brain, manipulating memories, implanting thoughts. My father believed it was being funded by a group of wealthy individuals, people who had a stake in controlling the future. But he couldn't prove it. He couldn't prove any of it before he disappeared." Stephen's eyes narrowed. "Who are these people? Who's behind this?" Helena closed her eyes, shaking her head. "I don't know. But I have a feeling that we're getting closer. The people who did this to my father, they're watching us right now." Stephen turned back to Rebecca, who was staring at the desk, her face pale, her body tense. The weight of the truth was settling over them like a suffocating cloud, but there was no turning back now. They had uncovered something monumental, something that would shake the foundations of society itself. "We need to find the rest of the records," Stephen said, his voice resolute. "We need to know who is involved and where they're hiding." Helena nodded, her expression hardening. "Follow me." With that, She turned and led them deeper into the manor, further into the darkness that seemed to swallow everything in its path. But Stephen was ready. He had come this far, and he would see it through to the end. They would uncover the truth, no matter the cost. The journey deeper into the manor was a calculated risk. With each step, Stephen felt as if they were venturing further into the belly of a beast, one whose teeth had already claimed lives and were now eager for more. The corridor that stretched ahead was narrow, lined with old paintings covered in layers of dust, their subjects staring out with hollow eyes. As they walked, the soft creaking of the wooden floor beneath them was the only sound, an unsettling accompaniment to the oppressive silence that loomed. Helena moved ahead with purpose, but Stephen couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong, something far more insidious than even what they had uncovered so far. The photograph of the woman, the one that had haunted his thoughts, weighed heavily in his pocket. He had recognized her eyes, the slight arch of her brows, a detail that couldn't be a coincidence. It had to be connected to Rebecca's father, but how? Behind him, Rebecca remained quiet, lost in her thoughts. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her, her knuckles white. Despite the resolve in her face, there was fear in her eyes, fear of what she might find, fear of what would come next. "We're getting close," Helena said over her shoulder, her voice echoing faintly in the hallway. Her steps quickened as if to match the increasing urgency in the air. "My father kept a set of files in this room. Everything he discovered, it's all there. It will explain everything." Stephen didn't need any more convincing. They had come too far to turn back now. Finally, they reached a large wooden door at the end of the hall. Helena's hand trembled slightly as she reached for the handle, her breath shallow. She hesitated for a moment, as if preparing herself for what they were about to uncover, then pushed the door open. The room beyond was even more peculiar than the study. The walls were lined with old filing cabinets, each one marked with dates, numbers, and cryptic symbols. But it was the desk at the center of the room that caught Stephen's attention. Unlike the other rooms they had seen, this one was clean, organized, almost sterile. It looked like someone had deliberately left it undisturbed, as though they were expecting someone to find it, just as Stephen and Rebecca had done. On the desk lay several open folders, all containing a mixture of handwritten notes and printed documents. As Stephen sifted through them, one name stood out above the rest: the Crimson Project. The documents were filled with references to a series of experiments conducted on individuals, many of whom had been selected from orphanages or hospitals, discarded by society, and altered in ways that defied explanation. They were experiments in control, mental and physical manipulation, attempts to erase or implant memories, and to bend the will of the individual to the whims of the project's creators. Stephen's heart raced as he flipped through the pages. These weren't just medical experiments, they were the key to something much larger, something that could change the very fabric of society. What is this?" Rebecca whispered, leaning over Stephen's shoulder. Her voice trembled as she read the notes, the same terror Stephen had felt spreading across her face. "This," Stephen said, his voice tight, "is the beginning of everything." At the bottom of one of the folders was a photograph, and Stephen's pulse quickened. The image depicted a young woman, the same woman from the previous photo he'd found. She was smiling now, standing beside a man in a white lab coat, her eyes eerily familiar. He had seen her before, somewhere. The pieces were starting to click into place, and yet, there was a part of him that still couldn't believe it. "Her name," Helena said softly, stepping forward to stand beside him, "is Elena Forsyth." My father told me she was his closest associate. But she disappeared years ago, before he could expose the truth. Rebecca's eyes flicked from the photograph to Stephen, a question in her gaze. What's her connection to all of this? Stephen stared at the photo, trying to piece together the puzzle. Elena Forsythe had been deeply involved in the experiments, no doubt, but there was more to her than just her role in the project. There was something about her connection to Rebecca's father that felt too personal, too intimate. But what? I think she knew something, Stephen said, more to himself than anyone else. Something that could unravel this whole operation. And I think your father got too close. Helena's eyes narrowed. She was involved with my father, wasn't she? Her voice faltered, but she quickly regained her composure. She was the one who helped him uncover the corruption, who was feeding him the information. But the deeper he got, the more dangerous it became. Elena, she had her own reasons for wanting to expose the project. She was trying to bring it all down from the inside. But she couldn't, Stephen murmured. He turned back to the papers, scanning them for any final clue that might lead to the woman's fate. I think she found a way to stop them. I think she may have disappeared intentionally, in order to gather the final pieces without drawing attention to herself. Rebecca took a deep breath. If she's still alive, then she's our only lead to uncovering the people behind this. Stephen nodded slowly, his mind racing with the possibilities. This wasn't just about solving a murder anymore. It was about taking down an entire network, a shadowy organization that operated in the darkest corners of society, pulling strings that no one had even noticed. But now, they were so close. Helena reached out, her fingers brushing the edge of a thick manila folder. She hesitated before opening it, a dark look passing over her face as she revealed the contents inside. The pages were marked with a single word, termination. Stephen's stomach churned as he scanned the papers. They detailed a list of names, high-ranking officials, businessmen, and individuals from across various sectors. Each name was followed by a list of potential terminations, people who had become a threat to the project and had been disposed of in secret. And there, at the bottom of the list, was her father's name. He had been marked for elimination. As the weight of their discovery pressed down on him, Stephen's mind raced. The conspiracy was larger than they had imagined, and Rebecca's father's death had been just one part of a much darker puzzle. We have to find Elena Forsythe, Stephen said, his voice cold with determination. She's the key to exposing all of this. But just as the words left his mouth, a sudden noise echoed through the manor, a faint sound, but unmistakable. It was a door slamming shut, followed by the unmistakable creak of footsteps. Someone was coming. Stephen's hand instinctively reached for his gun as he turned toward the door. The walls felt suddenly alive, closing in around them. They had been discovered. Get ready, he whispered to Rebecca and Helena. We're not alone anymore. Case 7, The Island of Lies. The letter had arrived without warning, slipping through the cracks of Stephen Raul Hughes' otherwise predictable existence like an unwanted shadow. The envelope was thick, ivory-colored, with no return address, only a single wax seal stamped with a strange, unidentifiable emblem. His fingers brushed the seal as he opened it, the weight of the paper somehow feeling heavier than it should, as though it carried with it the burden of secrets. The letter, written in neat, flowing handwriting, offered no explanation, only an invitation. You are cordially invited to a private gathering on an isolated island off the coast, it read. A select group of individuals has been chosen, and you are one of them. A handsome fee will be provided for your participation. Further details will be revealed upon your arrival. It seemed both formal and personal at once, yet it offered no specific information on why he'd been invited. There were no names, no explanations, only a vague assurance of comfort and luxury upon his arrival. No indication of the host. But the last line caught his attention: be prepared for a once-in-a-lifetime experience. Stephen wasn't one to indulge in fanciful notions, but there was something irresistibly magnetic about the invitation. Something in the way it was worded, something in the very nature of the unknown compelled him to respond. His profession as a detective, after all, often led him down paths full of uncertainty, and perhaps it was that same curiosity, the yearning to uncover the truth beneath layers of deception, that drew him in. In a way, it mirrored the feeling he had when solving a particularly perplexing case, an itch that could only be scratched by going deeper. So, with little more than the promise of mystery, he made arrangements to attend. The journey itself was uneventful, yet when Stephen arrived at the dock, the island loomed ahead, its silhouette dark against the early evening sky. The boat that had brought him seemed almost too small to traverse the great expanse of water separating the mainland from the remote island. A heavy fog hung low, almost as if the island were trying to hide itself from view, only allowing its shape to be seen in fragments. He could already feel a twinge of unease, an emotion he often dismissed as irrelevant, but one that now crept under his skin like an unsettling premonition. Once on the island, the landscape immediately felt different. The air was damp, filled with a salty tang from the ocean that carried the scent of decay. The mansion ahead, built from stone and towering above the rest of the island like a fortress, was stark against the overcast sky. The architecture was grand but cold, with sharp angles and high arches that cast long shadows. It seemed oddly out of place in this isolated spot, as if it had been designed to intimidate, rather than to welcome. As Stephen made his way toward the mansion, the first glimpse of the other guests came into view. There was no welcoming staff, no butlers or servants, only a collection of strangers gathered together, each as confused and uncertain as he was. They stood in small, tight groups, exchanging wary glances but speaking little. Stephen's eyes scanned the crowd. There was a former politician, an aging retired general, a well-known socialite, and a few others whose names he didn't immediately recognize. All of them wore expressions of silent suspicion, as though they too had felt the pull of the unknown, though they were less willing to admit it. Something about the group struck him as strange, not just the variety of people, but the tension in the air that was palpable, like the hum of static before a thunderstorm. With a curt nod, Stephen joined the group standing closest to the door, noting that no one had yet made a move to enter. The invitation had instructed them to be punctual, but no one seemed eager to cross the threshold. Their eyes flitted nervously around, trying to gauge each other's reactions. It wasn't until a shadow moved behind one of the mansion's towering windows that a door creaked open, and a single voice called out, "Please, come inside." The speaker was unseen, but the voice was unmistakable, deep, firm, and strangely compelling. It had an almost authoritative edge to it, but it was the tone of mystery, not of command, that pushed everyone to move. One by one, the guests began to step into the darkened hall. The inside of the mansion was as imposing as its exterior, if not more so. Grand chandeliers dangled from the ceiling, and the dark wood paneling that lined the walls gleamed faintly in the dim light. Yet the mansion felt eerily deserted. There were no personal touches, no evidence of a life lived within. It seemed more like a place to observe, to listen, than a place to live. The silence was so thick it felt suffocating. A figure appeared in the doorway at the far end of the hall, a man dressed in a dark suit. His face was partially obscured by shadows, but his presence was enough to draw the guests' attention. He was the host, though his identity remained hidden. He welcomed them in a terse, almost mechanical manner. "Welcome to the island. You have been chosen for a reason," he said, his voice deep and deliberate. "No need for introductions. You will learn what you need to know in time." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to sink in. "There will be a dinner shortly. I suggest you rest and refresh yourselves until then." A murmur of uncertainty passed through the group. No one spoke immediately, as if none dared break the strange, unspoken code of silence that had settled between them. Stephen, however, felt something gnawing at the edge of his mind. This was no ordinary gathering. This was no retreat for the elite or a place for idle conversation. This was a game. And he was playing it whether he wanted to or not. Before they could process what had been said, the host turned and retreated into the shadows, leaving them to their own devices. The guests exchanged uncertain looks, none daring to speak. Stephen, however, stepped forward, his sharp instincts telling him to keep moving. He walked through the hallway, inspecting the rooms, the windows, and the doors, familiarizing himself with his surroundings in case the need for action arose. In a corner of the grand hallway, he spotted a small note pinned to the wall. It was a simple line of text. 10 invited, 10 will remain. The rest will fall. Stephen's heart skipped a beat. The words were cryptic, but they spoke volumes. The mansion, the guests, and the invitation, it was all part of some larger, darker plan. And as the tension in the air began to swell, Stephen knew this was just the beginning. He was about to uncover something much darker than he could have ever anticipated. The heavy silence inside the mansion was finally broken when the clock struck 8. The guests, having wandered the grand hall and several of the rooms in uneasy silence, were ushered into a large dining room. A long table was set with silver cutlery, crystal goblets, and spotless white linens. The lighting was dim, casting soft, amber glows on the faces of the guests, making the atmosphere feel both luxurious and unsettling. Each of them took their place around the table, still exchanging wary glances. Stephen Raul Hughes, ever vigilant, scanned the room. The tension that had settled upon the group was like a physical weight. Every guest seemed to sense it, even if they couldn't articulate why. There was no warmth here, no laughter, no casual conversation. Just an undercurrent of fear. The mysterious host was nowhere to be seen, but their presence was felt everywhere, lurking just beyond the corners of the room. The strange feeling that Stephen had once dismissed as paranoia now felt undeniable. There was something wrong here, and he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The sound of distant footsteps echoed throughout the mansion, yet the door remained shut, the figure of the host hidden from view. The meal was served quickly, but it was cold, lacking any personal touch or hospitality. It felt like they were being fed, not for sustenance, but for some other, darker purpose. The plates, though beautifully arranged, lacked warmth, as though they had been prepared far in advance. As the meal progressed, the guests fell into a nervous silence, the clink of silver against porcelain the only sound filling the room. Stephen barely touched his food, instead observing his fellow diners. The former politician, who had appeared so confident earlier, now seemed unnervingly stiff, his face pale under the dim lighting. The retired general kept his eyes fixed on the table, his hand shaking slightly as he lifted his glass to his lips. The socialite, who had been chattering nervously since the moment she arrived, now had her lips pressed tight, her eyes darting nervously toward the door. Suddenly, there was a sharp, blood-curdling scream that tore through the silence. It echoed from somewhere deep within the mansion, a cry of sheer terror. The guests froze, all eyes turning toward the source of the scream. It was impossible to tell where it had come from, but it was unmistakable. Someone, somewhere in the mansion, was in mortal danger. Stephen's instincts kicked in. Without a word, he stood from the table and began to move toward the source of the scream. The other guests, too startled to speak, followed in a hesitant group, their movements clumsy as they tried to make sense of what had just happened. The host was nowhere to be seen, and the mansion's eerie stillness seemed to have magnified the terror that now gripped the group. Stephen reached the hallway first, his sharp eyes scanning the surroundings. He could hear the hurried footsteps of the others behind him, but he moved with purpose, his mind already formulating the possible causes. A practical joke? A misplaced scream? Or something far more sinister? The possibility of danger was real, and Stephen knew it. When he reached the source of the scream, a large, darkened parlor, he hesitated. The door was ajar, and a faint flickering light could be seen from within. A candle, he assumed, struggling to stay lit in the heavy air. His hand rested on the door handle, and he pushed it open slowly. Inside, the scene was almost impossible to comprehend. The body of one of the guests, an elderly man who had introduced himself as a retired judge, lay sprawled on the floor, blood pooling around him. His face was contorted in a look of utter horror, eyes wide and frozen in a glassy stare. His neck had been twisted at an unnatural angle, a dark bruise forming where his skin had been crushed. The guests who had followed Stephen gasped in shock, their faces drained of color. The retired general stepped forward, kneeling beside the body to check for a pulse, though everyone knew it was too late. The judge was dead. "What the hell is going on here?" someone whispered. It was the former politician, his voice shaking with barely contained panic. His hands trembled as he wiped his brow with a handkerchief. Stephen knelt beside the judge, his mind already working. He observed the scene meticulously, as any detective would. The judge's body lay near an ornate fireplace, the fire having long since died out. His hand was outstretched, as though reaching for something, but there was nothing in his grasp. A glance at the window revealed it to be locked from the inside, and there were no signs of a struggle. His death had been swift and calculated, no sign of robbery or a botched attempt at a violent crime. "What could have happened?" one of the guests muttered, clearly on edge. The tension was palpable, thick with fear. "Was it an accident?" "No," Stephen said, his voice sharp and unwavering. He stood up slowly, his eyes scanning the room. "This was no accident." "What do you mean?" the general asked, looking up at Stephen. Stephen's gaze locked onto the other guests. His sharp mind had already deduced a few things, but the most pressing question remained: why? Why had the judge been killed so quickly? And why now, when the group was already on edge? "There is something off about this place," Stephen continued. "But we are all still here. We have no choice but to face whatever comes next." A long silence followed. There was no doubt in anyone's mind that the island was not what it seemed, and that the killings had only just begun. One of them had been murdered, and Stephen knew that if he didn't act quickly, They would all be victims in a deadly game with no way to escape. As the group stood there in shock, Stephen's mind turned to the note he had seen earlier in the hall, the one that had read, 10 invited, 10 will remain. The rest will fall. The first death had been a warning. And he had no doubt that more would follow. He had to uncover the truth before it was too late. But the island itself seemed to conspire against him, its mysteries growing darker by the hour. The atmosphere in the mansion had shifted irrevocably. What had once been an elegant, if peculiar, gathering now felt like a trap. The guests moved in hushed, anxious clusters, each step measured as if the very floorboards might give way beneath them. Fear hung in the air like a suffocating fog, and Stephen Raul Hughes could sense it settling deeper into every crevice of the old building. They had left the judge's body in the parlor, the retired general standing vigil, though there was little doubt the man had been dead for hours. Stephen, though concerned for the other guests, couldn't stop his mind from unraveling the mystery of the death. No one seemed to understand the implications of what had just happened, at least, not in the way he did. This wasn't a random murder, it was something deliberate. The judge had been singled out for a reason, and Stephen knew that reason wasn't just personal, it was connected to something far bigger. As the evening wore on, the guests retreated to the drawing room, the library, and the few remaining corners of the mansion, each area bathed in the same oppressive silence. Stephen sat in the library, observing the others through a heavy haze of smoke. He felt like an outsider now, alone with his thoughts. His mind raced through every detail of the murder, the body, the placement, the lack of a struggle. It was all too neat, too calculated. Whoever was behind this wasn't just murdering for revenge or out of malice, they were making a point. A low murmur broke his train of thought. The woman who had been seated across from him, the socialite who had been frantically biting her nails earlier in the evening, was now standing in the doorway, her face pale. She appeared to be on the verge of collapse. "Detective Hughes," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You need to come quickly." Without a word, Stephen stood up and followed her down the narrow corridor, past the row of closed doors. As they reached the stairs, Stephen's instincts flared. Something wasn't right. He could hear the muffled sounds of someone stumbling in the upper hall, the scrape of shoes against wood. Another scream. Upstairs, the socialite gasped, her breath shallow. "It's happening again." Stephen didn't wait for any more words. He moved swiftly, pulling himself up the staircase with the fluidity of someone used to urgency. He reached the top, his eyes scanning the dimly lit hallway. At first, there was no sound, no sign of movement. Then he saw it. One of the other guests, the former politician, the man who had been shaking with fear earlier, was sprawled on the floor. His body lay at an unnatural angle, and a thin trickle of blood marred the white tile beneath him. The windows in the hallway were wide open, but there was no indication that anyone had come in or gone out. The air was still, stagnant. "Another one," Stephen murmured, crouching next to the body. The man's face was still contorted in shock, his eyes wide and vacant. This wasn't an accident either. The politician hadn't been robbed, hadn't been involved in any kind of struggle. There were no defensive wounds, no marks of any kind to suggest a fight. Just like the judge, he had been caught off guard, killed quickly, efficiently. Stephen stood and stepped back, scanning the area. His mind was already turning, fitting together the pieces of the puzzle. There was a pattern here, but he needed more information. He had to figure out who was behind this before anyone else fell victim. "This is no coincidence," Stephen said quietly, mostly to himself. He glanced over his shoulder at the socialite, who had been hovering anxiously behind him. "Do you recognize the man?" The socialite shook her head, her face pale. I barely spoke to him. He was so intimidating. Always talking about his connections. He seemed obsessed with power." Stephen noted her words, though they seemed to carry little weight at the moment. He had no doubt that whatever connections the politician had been boasting about would be of little help to him now. It wasn't power that had saved him, it was the sharpness of someone's blade, or whatever weapon had been used to strike him down. "Who else was with you when the first scream happened?" Stephen asked, turning back to the socialite. "Anyone unusual? Someone who seemed out of place?" "I don't know," she stammered. "We were all in the dining room together when it happened. After the judge was found, we scattered. Everyone went to their own corners." Stephen turned his attention back to the body. His eyes narrowed. "And then, someone found him?" "Yes, I found him. I wasn't sure if I should come to you, or—" "Good," Stephen said, cutting her off. "Stay here with the body. Don't move it. I need to take a look at the rest of the house." Stephen's mind was racing. 2 murders, and the similarities between them were too striking to ignore. Both victims had been among the most outspoken in the group, and both had fallen victim in an unexpected manner, in a place where they should have felt safe. He turned to the hallway, his eyes flicking from shadow to shadow, studying every corner with the same precise intensity. The house felt like a maze now, and the guests within it were trapped. But chills swept over him. He was being watched. Stephen made his way back downstairs, his footsteps silent against the wood, his mind still turning over the puzzle. He had no time to waste. Someone among them was orchestrating these deaths, and if he didn't find out who soon, more would follow. The guests were already paranoid, terrified, looking over their shoulders as if they were prey. He needed to act fast. Time was running out. The mansion had grown eerily quiet after the second murder. The guests, who had once moved in groups, now kept to themselves, casting nervous glances at one another. The weight of fear hung heavy, pressing down on everyone in the house. Stephen Raul Hughes had seen many things in his life, crimes committed in the dark, ruthless killers hiding in plain sight, but nothing had prepared him for this. He was no longer just a guest at a strange gathering, he was in the middle of something far worse. He was part of a game, a deadly, twisted game. He had barely finished inspecting the body of the former politician when his sharp ears caught the distant sound of hurried footsteps. It was coming from the stairwell. Stephen's instincts kicked in, and he followed the sound at once, moving with swift precision. By the time he reached the landing, the heavy wooden door of one of the guest rooms had swung open, and he saw a woman, one of the younger guests, a reporter by trade, sprinting down the hallway, her face contorted in fear. Detective Hughes." Her voice was shrill, panicked. "It's happening again. Please, come quickly." Without a word, Stephen followed her down the long hallway, his mind working in overdrive. 3 deaths in one night, and the killer was still among them. Whoever was behind this was growing bolder with each passing hour. There would be no way to stop the bloodshed unless Stephen could put together the pieces before the murderer struck again. They arrived at the scene of the 3rd death, another guest, a middle-aged woman who had been one of the more vocal members of the group. She had worked as an archaeologist, Stephen recalled, and had been quite outspoken in her brief conversations. She had an air of confidence about her that, in hindsight, seemed to mask her underlying anxiety. Now, that confidence was gone. The woman was lying on the floor, face up, her expression frozen in shock. Blood had pooled around her body, and her once pristine, tailored dress was stained a deep crimson. There were no visible wounds. No signs of struggle. But the look on her face, the terror etched in her wide eyes, spoke volumes. Stephen knelt beside her, examining her closely. His fingers hovered over her neck, checking for any signs of bruising or marks, anything that could indicate a cause of death. But there was nothing, no marks, no sign of violence, no sign of a weapon. This death, like the others, was clean, precise. Poison, Stephen muttered under his breath, as he ran his fingers over her clothing, looking for any clues. It's always poison. He stood up slowly, his mind clicking into place. The deaths had a pattern, a certain consistency that suggested careful planning. Whoever was behind this was not simply killing at random. The deaths were methodical, as though the murderer was controlling the pace of the killings, manipulating the terror of the remaining guests with each death. He turned to the others who had gathered outside the room, their faces pale, their bodies tense. They were all on edge, each of them silently wondering who would be next. But Stephen's mind was focused on something else, something crucial. The woman was poisoned, Stephen said aloud, his voice steady but cold. There's no sign of violence, no weapon. Whoever did this used something subtle, something we wouldn't immediately suspect. Poison? The socialite asked, her voice shaking. She was standing by the door, her hand pressed to her mouth as if trying to stifle a sob. How do you know? Stephen turned to face her, his expression unreadable. Because it's the only explanation that makes sense. The judge, the politician, now this woman, none of them were physically attacked. Whoever is behind this knows how to kill without leaving a trace. They are using poison to take us down one by one. The words seemed to sink in slowly, and a murmur passed through the small crowd. No one had dared say it aloud, but they were all thinking the same thing now. They were trapped. There was no escape. They were all sitting ducks, waiting for the murderer to strike again. How do we stop it? The retired general asked, his voice low, his face grim. How do we find out who's doing this? Stephen's eyes flicked toward the group, analyzing their faces, reading the fear and confusion in their eyes. He knew that in a situation like this, it was easy to let panic take over. But he couldn't afford to lose his composure. Not yet. We need to be methodical, Stephen said, his voice cutting through the tension in the room. We can't trust anyone here. But we can observe. Pay attention to every detail. Every gesture, every word, every action. One of you is the killer. The silence that followed was palpable. No one spoke, and for a moment, it felt as though the entire mansion had gone still. Then the socialite's voice broke through the thick air. I don't understand, she whispered, her face pale. Why are we being killed? What's the reason for this? Stephen looked at her carefully, studying her expression. She was terrified, of course she was, but there was something more there, something he couldn't quite place. A flicker of guilt? Perhaps. Or maybe she was simply playing her part in a larger drama. Either way, he couldn't afford to trust anyone right now. I don't know the answer to that, he replied, his gaze narrowing. But I do know one thing. Whoever is doing this wants us all dead. And unless we figure out who it is, we'll all die here. The mansion was quieter now, the stillness almost unbearable. The air in the grand house seemed thicker, each breath Stephen Raul Hughes took feeling heavier than the last. With each passing hour, the tension among the remaining guests grew, each person casting furtive glances at the others, wondering who would be next. 3 murders in a single night, and yet the murderer was still here, hidden amongst them. The game was far from over, and Stephen's time was running out. He paced slowly through the hallway, his mind whirring as he went over every piece of the puzzle. He had come to one conclusion: the deaths were not random. Whoever was behind them was very methodical, very controlled. The victims were not chosen haphazardly. There was a clear pattern, even if it was not immediately obvious. The question was, what was the motive? What did the killer want? And how could Stephen find them before another death occurred? The other guests, now more somber than ever, had gathered in the library. They were a fractured group, each person retreating into themselves, trying to make sense of the chaos. Stephen knew he needed to confront them. The walls had closed in on all of them, and it was time to expose the truth. He stepped into the room, his eyes scanning the group. The retired general was sitting at the far end of the room, his hands folded in front of him, deep in thought. The socialite sat nervously by the fireplace, occasionally glancing over her shoulder as if expecting something or someone to come at her from the shadows. The remaining guests were huddled in their own clusters, whispering quietly among themselves, but all of them were on edge. Stephen walked to the center of the room, his eyes never leaving the faces of those assembled. He could feel the weight of their stares on him, a mixture of fear and suspicion. But he also knew something else. There was a growing sense of hope in the room, a belief that perhaps he, with his sharp mind and unyielding resolve, could unravel the mystery before it was too late. "The killer is among us," Stephen said, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife. "And I believe I know who it is." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Every face turned toward him, every ear straining to hear. The air grew tense again, thick with anticipation. "You see," Stephen continued, "I've been watching. Observing. And I believe the deaths are not random. They are connected. Every victim had something in common. They were all vocal, outspoken in their own way, each one of them leaving behind a trail of information, secrets that others wanted silenced." He paused, letting his words sink in. The guests were hanging on every word, their eyes wide with fear and curiosity. "But there's more," he went on. "The poison used to kill them isn't just a poison. It's specific, deliberate. And there's a connection between the poison and the people who were killed. It's not just a random method of murder. It's part of a larger plan. A plan to wipe out those who knew too much." Stephen turned and walked toward the grand table at the center of the room, where a decanter of brandy stood. He picked it up slowly, his fingers brushing against the glass. The guests watched in rapt attention. "There's something here," he said, tapping the decanter lightly. "This decanter has been in the center of almost every meal tonight. And while it hasn't been the source of the poison, it's a symbol. A symbol of the lies, the secrets, and the power that some of us are trying to hide." He turned and faced the group. "The killer is using poison as a means of silencing people who threaten to expose something much larger than any of us could have anticipated. But it's not just about the deaths, it's about controlling who gets to speak and who gets to know the truth. A gasp rose from the socialite as she realized what Stephen was implying. The people who've been murdered were all connected in one way. They were asking too many questions. Digging too deep, Stephen said. The judge, the politician, and the archaeologist, all of them were involved in the same circle of individuals. They were all aware of something that the killer didn't want coming to light. The room was silent, and for the first time since the killings began, Stephen felt a flicker of hope in the air. He was getting closer to the truth. Then, just as he was about to continue, a loud thud echoed from above. A scream, followed by a loud crash. Without a second thought, Stephen bolted toward the staircase, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't need to think twice. He knew what it meant, another murder. He burst into the room at the top of the stairs and found the body of the retired general lying sprawled across the floor. His face was twisted in an expression of shock and pain, his hand clutching his chest. Another silent death, swift, deliberate, and with the same clean precision as the others. The decanter. Stephen turned quickly, his mind racing. The decanter. It had to be the key. Whoever was behind this was still hiding in plain sight. He hadn't accounted for the method of poisoning. He'd assumed it was something ingested directly, something hidden in the food. But this time, the poison wasn't just in the food, it was in the drink, spread out through every glass, every goblet that had been passed around. He turned and faced the room full of trembling guests. His eyes locked onto each one of them. The killer was among them. The game was nearly over. The truth was within his grasp. But he needed one final piece. Someone here is trying to stop us from getting too close to the truth, Stephen said, his voice steady despite the rising tension. And they won't stop until we're all dead. He paused, watching their faces, seeing the mixture of fear and guilt that was slowly rising. It was time to bring everything into focus. "Who are you?" he demanded. The room fell into silence once more. The guests exchanged fearful glances, but no one spoke. Stephen knew. He had everything he needed. Now, it was time to end it. Case 8, The Forgotten Truth. The telephone rang in the dead of night. The shrill sound echoed through the quiet apartment, slicing through the dark silence that had settled over the city. Stephen Raul Hughes, who had been deep in thought as he reviewed notes from a previous case, instinctively reached for the phone before the first ring could fade into the abyss. "Detective Hughes," he said in his usual calm, measured tone, his voice betraying no hint of the weariness that had accumulated after years of unsolved mysteries. "Detective, I need your help." The voice on the other end was shaking, barely controlled, like a nervous wreck on the verge of breaking. A woman, in her 30s, her words tumbling out in panic. "There's a man here at the station. He's covered in blood, but he has no memory of what happened, no idea how it got there. He keeps saying he's responsible, but he doesn't remember why. He doesn't remember who the victim is, or anything about the murder." Stephen's mind instantly flickered into action. A man covered in blood, a total lack of memory, and a sense of guilt that he couldn't place. The pieces of the puzzle were vague but familiar. He had worked on similar cases before, cases that didn't add up, that unraveled slowly, like a thread caught on a needle. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, Stephen replied, hanging up the phone with a soft click. It didn't take long to reach the precinct, even in the dead of night. When he arrived, the precinct's lights were harsh against the darkness, casting long shadows across the street. Inside, the atmosphere was tense, as if the precinct had been holding its breath. There was something unnerving about the case from the start, a sense that it wasn't just the usual assault or theft. The receptionist looked up as Stephen walked through the door. "Detective Hughes," she greeted him, nodding in his direction. "The man you're looking for is in the interrogation room. I've already informed Officer Reynolds. He's with him now." Stephen didn't waste any time on small talk. He gave her a curt nod and made his way to the back of the building. He passed rows of empty desks and the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead. As he walked, the hairs on the back of his neck prickled, a warning he couldn't quite shake. He had seen many strange cases in his career, but there was something different about this one. Entering the interrogation room, Stephen saw the man sitting at the table. His appearance was striking, not because of his physical features, but because of the raw, almost childlike confusion in his eyes. His disheveled appearance suggested a man who had been through something traumatic. Blood was splattered across his white shirt, his hands trembling uncontrollably. The room smelled faintly of metal, a sickly reminder of what had transpired. The man looked up at Stephen, his eyes wide and searching for something in the detective's face. I don't know why I'm here," he murmured, voice shaking. "I don't know why I'm covered in blood. Please. I don't remember anything." Stephen's gaze was intense but empathetic. He dealt with countless individuals who had experienced similar amnesia. Sometimes, it was the shock of the event that clouded their memories. Other times, it was something more sinister, a deliberate erasure, perhaps, or a hidden truth that refused to surface. "I'm Detective Hughes," Stephen said, sliding into the chair across from the man. His voice was steady, soothing. "Can you tell me your name?" The man swallowed hard, his fingers twitching around the edges of the table. He looked down at his hands, as if the blood on them belonged to someone else. I don't know," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know who I am. My name. I can't remember it." Stephen took a deep breath, his mind already working. He'd seen people lose their memories in the aftermath of trauma, but this felt different. There was something more to it, something that wasn't adding up. The man's confusion wasn't just a symptom of shock, it felt like there was something deliberate about it. "Okay," Stephen said, his tone gentle but firm. "Let's start with what you do remember. Anything. Try to think. Where are you from? Do you recognize any of these officers here?" The man's brow furrowed as he searched his memory, the lines on his face deepening in concentration. After a few moments of silence, he spoke again, his voice quieter this time. I remember a house. There was a house. It's all I can see in my mind. A big house." Stephen leaned forward, narrowing his eyes. "Do you know where this house is?" I don't," the man admitted, shaking his head as if trying to push away the images that came rushing back. "But I know it's important. I think it's connected to all of this." He looked up at Stephen, a flicker of panic in his eyes. "I think I was there. And I think someone died." The detective's instincts sharpened. A house, a murder, and a man with no memory of how he got there. It was enough to pique Stephen's curiosity, but not enough to make him assume guilt. There was something wrong with the entire situation, and he needed to get to the heart of it. Was this man involved in the murder, or was he another victim in a larger scheme? Stephen knew that the answers would lie in finding the house. He needed to see it, to find out what happened there. But there was more to this than just the man's memory. He had the sense that the pieces were scattered, and only by digging deeper could he hope to put them together. "All right," Stephen said, breaking the silence. "We're going to figure this out. Tell me everything you can remember about the house. We'll find it." The man nodded, his hands gripping the edges of the table. He looked as if he were about to speak, but the words caught in his throat. It was clear now that the memories were slipping through his fingers, just out of reach. But Stephen wasn't going to give up. He would uncover the truth, piece by piece, no matter how long it took. As the man began to speak again, his voice faltering, Stephen's mind was already working on the next steps. The house was out there. The key to the murder was out there. And Stephen was determined to find it, no matter what the cost. The air in the interrogation room seemed to grow heavier as the man spoke, each word carrying more weight than the last. Stephen leaned forward slightly, listening intently. The man's face was pale, his hands still trembling as they clasped each other tightly in front of him. He was clearly on the verge of a breakdown, but Stephen needed him to focus, needed him to remember. "The house. I remember something about it. It's on the outskirts of the city," the man said, his voice low and strained. "It's old. Very old. Dark wood, creaky floors, there's something off about it. I keep thinking there's something I'm missing, something I should know." Stephen sat back in his chair, his gaze unblinking. A house on the outskirts of the city. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The unsettling feeling in his gut was growing, though. He had learned over the years to trust his instincts, and they were screaming at him now. There was something more to this, something deeper than just a simple case of memory loss or shock. He allowed the silence to linger, giving the man time to gather his thoughts. His eyes shifted to the clock on the wall. Every minute counted now. "What else?" Stephen prompted, keeping his voice steady. "Do you remember anyone else from the house? Anyone you might have seen there?" The man's brow furrowed, and he pressed a hand to his temple as if trying to clear the fog in his mind. There was someone," he murmured. "A woman. She was important. I think she was the one who." He stopped abruptly, his face paling further as if the words were too much to say. He swallowed hard, eyes darting nervously around the room. Stephen leaned forward again, his voice softer now. "Take your time. Who is she?" "I don't know her name," the man said, almost in a whisper, as though speaking it aloud might make it too real. "But she was the one who was." He trailed off again, eyes clouded with confusion and fear. "There was blood. So much blood. I don't know how it happened." The detective's mind raced. A woman, blood, and a house, pieces of a puzzle that were scattered but not yet fitting together. The man's panic seemed genuine, but Stephen knew better than to make assumptions. The man was either a victim, a witness, or a very convincing perpetrator of the crime. But his complete lack of memory suggested something deeper at play. "Okay," Stephen said, his tone neutral, but there was an edge of urgency behind it now. "We need to find out more about this woman. You said she was important. Did she live in the house with you? Was she the owner? Or did she just happen to be there?" I don't know," the man stammered, his eyes darting again, as though searching for the right answer in his mind. "But I think she was connected to me somehow." There was something about her that I should know. Something that would explain everything. But it's all just out of reach. I can't remember. The detective leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers on the table. His eyes never left the man, studying him carefully. He could see the effort the man was making to recall details, but there was an underlying sense that something was being deliberately withheld. Stephen's gut twisted in recognition. It was as though the man's memory wasn't just clouded, it was intentionally blocked, hidden behind some wall that kept it from surfacing. The memory could have been suppressed by trauma, but there was something Stephen couldn't ignore: the man's reaction to the mention of the woman and the blood. He was hiding something, whether he realized it or not. "Listen," Stephen said, his voice lowering to a more commanding tone. "We're going to find that house. I need you to keep thinking. Maybe if you tell me more about what happened before you got to that place, it will help. Do you remember anything else, anything at all before you ended up at the house? Maybe where you were, who you were with?" The man shook his head again. "I remember driving. I was driving. But I don't remember why. I don't remember where I was going." Stephen paused. Driving. It was a detail, small, but significant. He pressed on. "What kind of car were you in?" The man seemed to concentrate. "It was a dark sedan. Black, maybe. I don't know. I wasn't paying attention. I was just thinking. I thought I was alone." Stephen nodded, filing the information away. A black sedan, an anonymous vehicle, but perhaps it could lead him to something later. At least it was a lead. "All right," Stephen said, rising to his feet. "I'll need you to stay here for a bit longer. I'm going to have one of my officers search for that house you remember. We'll start there and see what we can find." The man nodded silently, his gaze dropping to the floor, clearly exhausted. As Stephen turned to leave, he could feel the weight of the case bearing down on him. There was something else beneath the surface of this man's story, a deeper truth that was hidden from view. But Stephen couldn't shake the nagging suspicion that this wasn't just a case of amnesia. There was a deliberate manipulation of the mind happening here, and he needed to uncover the person or persons behind it. As he walked out of the interrogation room, Stephen's mind was already working, piecing together the fragments of the case. He had learned long ago that there was always something more beneath the surface. And this case, with its black sedan and memory gaps, was no different. The truth was out there, buried beneath the layers of lies and confusion. And Stephen Raul Hughes would be the one to unearth it. The streets were quieter now, the city's pulse slowed as the clock ticked into the early hours of the morning. The weight of the case lingered in Stephen Raul Hughes' mind like a persistent shadow. He could feel the puzzle pieces still jumbled in his thoughts, too many loose ends, too many unanswered questions. The black sedan. The man's vague memories. The woman with the blood. The house. Each detail felt like a clue, but none of them felt like the breakthrough he needed. In the precinct, Stephen sat at his desk, sorting through the case files from earlier in the day. But his mind was far from the papers in front of him. The house, in particular, kept drawing him back. It was too prominent in the man's scattered recollections to be an insignificant detail. The house was the key, and Stephen needed to find it. "Detective Hughes," a voice interrupted his thoughts. It was Officer Reynolds, a young but sharp cop who had been assigned to assist him on the case. "We've got something on the house." Stephen looked up, the glimmer of hope momentarily crossing his expression. "Go on." Reynolds walked over to Stephen's desk, placing a file on top of the papers. "We managed to trace the man's memory, piece by piece. The house the man described is on the outskirts of the city. It's an old, abandoned property. There's nothing on the official records about its ownership, which is odd. But we found out that the property has been tied to a few incidents over the years. People have gone missing around it. Nothing solid, but enough to suggest it's a hotspot for something criminal." Stephen's eyes sharpened as he flipped open the file, scanning the details. A house with no ownership records, tied to disappearances. This was more than he had hoped for. "When was the last reported incident?" Stephen asked. "About a year ago," Reynolds replied, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "A woman was last seen near the house. She was connected to an ongoing investigation involving drug trafficking. But when we tried to follow the lead, it went cold. No body, no sign of a struggle, and no way to track her." "Who was the woman?" Stephen asked, his interest piqued. Was this the same woman the man remembered? Her name was Lily Martin. She was an investigative reporter, a freelance journalist who was looking into a story about corruption in the city's police force. She was seen meeting someone at the house, but then she vanished. No one knew what happened. Stephen leaned back in his chair, considering the implications. A missing woman, a journalist, last seen near an abandoned house with ties to mysterious disappearances. He couldn't ignore the eerie similarity to the man's description of the house and the woman he couldn't quite remember. There was a connection here, he just needed to find the thread. "Where is this house?" Stephen asked, his mind already racing ahead. Reynolds pulled a map from his bag and laid it out on the desk, pointing to a location on the outskirts of the city. "It's about 15 miles from here, isolated. There's no direct road access, just a trail leading into the woods. But we've been advised to be cautious. Whoever is connected to this place doesn't want to be found." Stephen's expression hardened. Caution was never something he took lightly. If someone wanted to hide, they'd leave a trail of clues. He just had to be diligent enough to find it. He knew this house was more than just a crime scene. It was part of something much bigger. "I'll go," Stephen said, his voice firm. "Get the team together. We're going to check out this house." By the time the small convoy of officers arrived at the outskirts of the city, the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the dense forest. The house stood at the edge of the woods, half hidden among the overgrown trees. Its once grand structure had fallen into ruin, the windows boarded up, and the paint peeling from the walls like old skin. The place looked abandoned, but there was a presence there, something Stephen couldn't shake, something about the eerie silence that made his skin crawl. "Stay sharp," Stephen ordered as they approached. "If this place has anything to do with the disappearances, it won't be easy." The officers nodded, following him as he made his way up the cracked stone path. The air felt colder as they neared the house, a biting chill that seemed to rise from the very ground beneath their feet. Stephen paused at the front door, scanning the area for any sign of life. "We'll split up," Stephen instructed. "Check the perimeter, see if there's anything inside that's been disturbed recently. Don't touch anything until I say so." As the officers spread out, Stephen took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. There was something about this place that felt wrong, something beyond the decay and the silence. He reached for the door handle, but as his fingers brushed the cold metal, a sound from inside the house made him stop dead in his tracks. A soft creak, footsteps, faint but distinct, echoing from somewhere deep within. Someone was inside. Without thinking, Stephen pushed the door open, the creak of the hinges loud in the stillness. His heart pounded in his chest as he stepped inside, the musty air assaulting his senses. The dim light filtering in through the boarded-up windows barely illuminated the dust-choked furniture, the sagging walls, and the shattered remnants of a once stately home. "Anyone in here?" Stephen called, his voice low and controlled. No response. He motioned for the officers to fan out, sweeping the dark corners of the room with flashlights. They moved quickly, their boots scraping against the wooden floorboards as they investigated. Stephen moved further into the house, his eyes searching every inch for a sign of movement. And then, as if on cue, he found a small trail of blood leading down a narrow hallway at the back of the house. He motioned for Reynolds to follow him. The two of them moved cautiously, the only sound the shuffle of their footsteps and their breathing. The blood trail grew thicker, darker, until it stopped in front of a door, an old, heavy door that seemed to be untouched by time. Stephen reached for the handle and pushed it open slowly. What lay behind it made his stomach twist. On the floor, in the center of the room, lay a body, bloody, lifeless, and unmistakably familiar. It was Lily Martin, the missing journalist. But there was something else. A small note, placed neatly beside her body, written in a hurried, shaky hand. "You're getting too close. This house holds more than you know." Stephen stood frozen for a moment, his mind racing. The woman's connection to the house was clear now, but the note. It was a message, a warning. But who was it from? And why was Lily here? The pieces were falling into place, but this was far from over. Stephen knew that the truth would take him deeper into the shadows, and the dangers were only beginning. The room was still, save for the sound of their heavy breathing and the occasional creak of the house settling around them. Stephen stood frozen in the doorway, his mind racing as he looked at the body of Lily Martin, sprawled lifeless on the floor. The blood was fresh, the wound still too raw. But it wasn't just her death that rattled him, it was the message. "You're getting too close. This house holds more than you know." Reynolds was the first to break the silence. "What do we do now, sir?" His voice was strained, but there was no hint of fear, just an urgency. Stephen's gaze was fixed on the note, his mind working in overdrive. This wasn't just a murder. This was a warning, a message to anyone who dared uncover the truth about this house and its secrets. And that truth, he could feel it in his bones, was tied to something much larger than he could have imagined. The house wasn't just abandoned. It was a hub for something insidious. Lily Martin had been here to investigate, just as he was. But now she was dead, and Stephen knew he was on the precipice of something dangerous. "We need to secure the room. No one touches anything until the forensic team arrives," Stephen said, his voice firm. "And get the rest of the team in here. We need to comb this place from top to bottom." Reynolds nodded and quickly relayed the orders. Stephen stepped further into the room, his eyes scanning the walls, the floor, every corner. The room was empty, aside from the body and the note, but there was a lingering feeling of something unseen, something lurking just beyond the surface. As he examined Lily's body, Stephen's mind returned to the case at hand. The woman had been researching corruption, tied to a story that could have blown the lid off a massive scandal within the city's political structure. Was she killed for her findings? Was she close to uncovering something that people in power didn't want exposed? Stephen was pulled from his thoughts by the sound of footsteps approaching. The rest of the team had arrived. They quickly began securing the perimeter, and the forensic team set to work, photographing the scene and collecting evidence. "Detective Hughes," Reynolds called out from across the room. Stephen turned to find the young officer standing near the corner, holding up a small object. Stephen moved over to him, his interest piqued. "What is it?" Reynolds handed him a small, tarnished key, its shape odd, unlike anything Stephen had seen before. The metal was old, the edges worn smooth from years of use. It didn't belong here, not in this house, not in this room. Stephen could feel the weight of it in his hand, like it was part of a much larger puzzle. "Where did you find this?" Stephen asked, his voice steady. "In the back corner, under a pile of old newspapers," Reynolds replied. It looked like it had been hidden there. Stephen's mind spun. A hidden key. It could open a door, a lock, a chest. It could lead to something or someone important. He couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that the key was significant. "We need to find where this goes," Stephen said. "This could be the next lead." The night stretched on as the investigation continued. The forensics team worked meticulously, and Stephen spent the hours questioning the officers and examining every piece of evidence. But the more he looked, the more questions arose. There was no sign of forced entry into the house. The front door had been unlocked, but Stephen knew from his experience that the killer had planned this carefully. This wasn't a random attack. Lily Martin had been followed, tracked, and ultimately led to this house. She had known too much, and someone had silenced her before she could expose them. Around 3 a.m., Stephen decided it was time to leave. The investigation in the house would continue, but he knew the next step was to find out who had been behind it all. He had the key. He had the note. But what was the connection between the house, the disappearances, and the corruption within the city? As Stephen and Reynolds made their way back to the car, his phone buzzed. He checked the screen, a text message from an unknown number. "You're not going to like what you find, Detective Hughes. But you're already in too deep. There's no turning back now." Stephen's stomach tightened. This wasn't just a warning. It was a confirmation that someone was watching him, waiting for him to make his next move. Whoever was behind this was as close as a shadow, just out of reach, but always there. Stephen gripped the phone tightly. There was no turning back, no stopping now. The pieces were all falling into place, but they didn't form a picture yet. But they would. He would find out who was behind Lily's death. He would find out who was behind the house. And, more than anything, he would find out the truth about what had happened to her and why she was killed. The morning after the grisly discovery at the house, Stephen Raul Hughes couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking a tightrope, suspended between two realities. On one side, there was the world he knew, structured, logical, governed by the cold truths of evidence and facts. On the other, there was the murky, shifting realm of corruption and deceit, where the lines between right and wrong blurred in the shadows. As Stephen sat in his office, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the desk, the weight of the case pressed on him like an anchor. Lily Martin's body had been discovered, but the answers were still eluding him. The key, the note, the house, it all led back to a single, inevitable conclusion. Whoever was behind this was powerful enough to silence anyone who dared expose their secrets. And Stephen knew that he was fast becoming a target himself. The phone on his desk buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. He picked it up without hesitation. Detective Hughes, a voice on the other end said, "It's Reynolds. We've got something." Stephen sat up straighter, his pulse quickening. "What is it?" "We've traced the key," Reynolds continued. "It belongs to a locked room at the back of the house. It's not a bedroom or storage space, it's something else. We think it might be connected to the old records of the house's past owners." Stephen's mind immediately jumped to the idea of hidden documents, proof of something, perhaps the house's true history, or even more secrets that could unravel the mystery. "Where's the room?" "It's on the second floor, at the end of the hallway. It's been untouched for years. We're heading there now." "Don't touch anything," Stephen said, his voice sharp. "I'll be there in 10 minutes. The drive to the house felt like an eternity. The city's skyline disappeared behind him as Stephen's thoughts raced. What had Lily discovered before she died? What had she been getting too close to? He gripped the steering wheel harder, feeling the tension in his jaw. When he arrived at the house, the air felt thicker, heavier. The same feeling that had gripped him the night before was still there, lingering, like a watchful presence. Reynolds met him at the front door, his face tense. "We've secured the area, just like you asked," Reynolds said. "But it's a lot worse than we thought. We found something else." Stephen's brow furrowed. "What now?" Reynolds led him up the stairs to the second floor, where a small door stood at the end of the long hallway. The key that had been found under the newspapers fit perfectly into the lock. As the door creaked open, Stephen's eyes scanned the dimly lit room. Inside was a small office, its walls lined with old bookshelves filled with faded ledgers, yellowing papers, and a large, dusty desk. At first glance, it seemed like just another abandoned room until Stephen's eyes were drawn to the far corner, where a collection of old newspaper clippings was pinned to a corkboard. His heart skipped a beat. The clippings were all connected to one thing: corruption in the city's political and law enforcement sectors. Each article highlighted a different scandal: a missing persons case, a botched investigation, a cover-up involving powerful people. And at the center of it all was a name he had seen before. Lily Martin. The journalist had been investigating these very crimes. These clippings were her notes, her work. She had been compiling evidence against a vast web of corruption that reached into the highest levels of government and law enforcement. Stephen felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise. This wasn't just a murder tied to a missing person. This was something far more dangerous. Someone had silenced Lily because she was close to uncovering a conspiracy that could bring the entire system down. "What do you think?" Reynolds asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Stephen didn't answer immediately. He was too busy piecing everything together in his mind. Lily hadn't been killed because she was a reporter. She had been killed because she was about to expose the truths that powerful people would do anything to protect. "This," Stephen said finally, turning to face Reynolds, "this is just the tip of the iceberg." The detective's eyes narrowed, his thoughts already spinning. He needed to go deeper. He needed to find out who was behind this, who was pulling the strings. The corruption was systematic, sprawling, and deeply entrenched. And Lily had been on the verge of revealing it all. Stephen looked around the room, his gaze falling on a small, locked drawer in the desk. He stepped forward, his fingers brushing against the wood. It was a subtle movement, but it was enough to feel the familiar sense of anticipation that always came before a breakthrough. "Reynolds," Stephen said, "break this open. We need to see what's inside." With a quick motion, Reynolds retrieved a crowbar from his bag and pried open the drawer. Inside, they found more papers, more files, each one more damning than the last. There were contracts, names, dates, and locations. There were testimonies and whispers of hidden deals. But there was one document that caught Stephen's eye, a confidential government report, dated just a few months ago. It was about a series of disappearances, all linked to a single location. The same location Stephen had visited the night before. The house. "Look at this," Stephen murmured, pointing to a section of the report. "This mentions a network of people connected to the house, people who were involved in trafficking, blackmail, and worse." Reynolds leaned in closer, reading over Stephen's shoulder. "This is bigger than we thought." Stephen's jaw clenched as he stared at the paper. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of it all. The house. The corruption. Lily's death. It was all connected, but the final piece was still elusive. "We're not done yet," Stephen said, determination in his voice. "We have to find out who's behind this and why they've gone to such lengths to keep it hidden." The silence that had hung over the house felt more oppressive than ever. Stephen knew they were getting closer. He could feel it in his gut. The deeper they went, the more dangerous this case became. Whoever was pulling the strings had made one fatal mistake. They had underestimated him. As he left the house, the weight of the case pressing down on him like a dark cloud, Stephen felt a strange sense of calm. The pieces were beginning to fall into place, and he knew that the next steps would take him even further into the heart of the storm. There was no going back now. Case 9. The Veil of Deception. The heavy winter fog had a way of crawling through the streets, wrapping the city in a muffled embrace that seemed to dull even the sharpest senses. Stephen Raul Hughes stood at the entrance of the grand mansion, his coat collar turned up against the chill. The house belonged to Dr. Andrew Hargrave, a respected physician who had served the city for decades. The elegance of the home only contrasted with the grim scene inside. When Hughes had arrived, the police had already cordoned off the area. Detective Reynolds met him at the door, his face pale with a mixture of exhaustion and concern. "It's not a typical case, Hughes," Reynolds said, leading him through the dimly lit hallway toward the study. "We've got a murder on our hands, but it doesn't feel like one. No signs of forced entry, nothing's missing, and the gunshot wound, it doesn't fit the profile." Hughes nodded, his mind already analyzing the situation. Hargrave's reputation had been spotless both as a physician and as a man. He was a quiet figure in the medical community, dedicated to helping the poor and underserved, someone who would be unlikely to make enemies. So why kill him? They entered the study, where Dr. Hargrave's lifeless body sat slumped in a large leather chair behind a grand oak desk. The room smelled of stale tobacco and expensive cologne, and the harsh light from a nearby desk lamp cast sharp shadows across the room. A window was slightly ajar, letting in a thin draft that rustled the papers scattered across the desk. Hugh's sharp eyes took in every detail: Hargrave's face, frozen in a grimace of shock, the gun in his right hand, even though it was clear from the angle of his body that he had been left-handed, and the pool of blood that had gathered beneath him, spreading out across the rich Persian rug. The desk was cluttered, as if the doctor had been interrupted in the middle of something, papers stacked high, some with medical jargon, others filled with shorthand that seemed too personal. "'Cause of death?" Hughes asked, his voice steady as he crouched next to the body. A single shot to the head. We're not sure yet whether it was a suicide or murder. The gunshot wound, though it doesn't make sense with the position of the body, Reynolds said, looking at the blood-stained carpet. Hughes stood and surveyed the rest of the room. A small table beside the chair held an empty glass, a few ice cubes still rattling inside. There was no blood anywhere near it, suggesting that Hargrave had been drinking before the fatal shot. On a nearby shelf, a row of medical journals lined the wall, meticulously ordered, while next to them, a small stack of papers sat haphazardly, as if they had been hurriedly thrown aside. There's more, Reynolds continued, stepping over to the desk. We found this. He handed Hughes a folded note. Stephen unfolded it, his brow furrowing as he read the words. The judgment is upon you. The sin cannot be erased. It was short, cryptic, and laden with a sense of finality. Hughes' mind began to churn with questions. Who had left this note? Why did they feel the need to send such a message? The mention of judgment and sin was clear. Whoever had written it, they had a personal stake in Hargrave's death. The idea of retribution seemed to echo from every line. Do we know who might have had access to Hargrave's study? Hughes asked, his voice low as he turned the note over in his hands. Reynolds shook his head. The place is locked up tight. His assistant says he was alone in here before he died, and there was no sign of anyone breaking in. The staff didn't hear anything unusual last night either. Hughes' eyes narrowed as he walked around the room, taking in every detail. His instinct told him this wasn't just a random act of violence. The note, the lack of struggle, and the doctor's impeccable reputation, this murder seemed calculated, deliberate. Someone had planned it carefully, and they had left a message behind, one that meant something to them. Get me a list of Dr. Hargrave's recent patients, Hughes ordered, his gaze scanning the cluttered desk once more. I need to know who he was seeing in the days leading up to his death. Right away, sir, Reynolds replied. Hughes stood in silence for a moment, contemplating the scene. His thoughts were interrupted when a sharp, creaking sound came from the hallway, a faint sound of footsteps approaching. He turned to find the housekeeper, a middle-aged woman with a worried expression, standing in the doorway. Detective Hughes, I didn't know if I should come forward, she said, her voice trembling. But there's something I think you should see. She stepped into the room, holding a small envelope. Hughes took it from her hands, noting the urgency in her expression. This was found this morning, right after the police arrived. It wasn't here when I left last night, she explained. I didn't want to touch it. It's addressed to you, Detective. Hughes hesitated for a moment before tearing open the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, marked with a symbol, a strange, ancient-looking sigil that resembled a cross with intricate markings around its edges. At the center of the symbol was a name, the Faithful Circle. Stephen's pulse quickened. He had heard of the Faithful Circle before, an underground religious group with a reputation for fanaticism and secrecy. Hargrave had worked with some of the city's most influential people, and it seemed impossible to imagine how this group could be involved in his death. But the symbol, along with the cryptic note, was not a coincidence. The Faithful Circle had to be tied to the murder somehow. The investigation has just taken a turn, Hughes muttered under his breath, turning to Reynolds. We need to dig into Hargrave's past. This isn't just a murder. This is part of something bigger. The pieces were falling into place, but the puzzle was far from complete. Dr. Andrew Hargrave's death had opened a door to a darker side of the city, one where secrets were buried deep and the lines between justice and vengeance blurred. Hughes could feel that this case was far from over. Stephen Hughes sat in his office, the flickering light of his desk lamp casting long shadows over the room. He studied the note once more, the words haunting him like an unsolved riddle. The cryptic message left at Dr. Hargrave's house was more than just a clue, it was a deliberate symbol, an indicator that the case was not as straightforward as it seemed. Whoever had killed Hargrave wanted to send a strong message, and the reference to judgment, sin, and finality was clearly personal. But personal for whom? And why? His fingers traced the jagged handwriting on the paper. The phrase "the faithful circle awaits" echoed in his mind. It wasn't just a religious reference, it felt like something deeper, tied to a group, a hidden agenda that had festered in the shadows for years. Hughes had heard whispers of such groups before, secret societies that operated in the underbelly of the city's elite. But this one? This was something different. Reynolds, standing at the door, interrupted his thoughts. "The note is a clue," Hughes murmured as he looked up, eyes narrowing in focus. Hargrave wasn't just killed for money, power, or greed. This has to be personal, something tied to his past. "I agree," Reynolds said, stepping inside and taking a seat across from Hughes. "I've been speaking to Hargrave's colleagues, and there's something odd about his work. He was involved in medical research that no one seemed to know much about. Some of his old patients are difficult to track down." Hughes's pulse quickened as the pieces began to fall into place. A doctor with a secretive past, a research project buried deep in the shadows, and a cryptic message. This was no random murder. Hargrave had been targeted for something specific, something that had been hidden away, and now someone was sending a message. But to whom? And for what reason? The words "the faithful circle awaits" haunted him once more. He knew that this group wasn't just a name, it was a well-hidden organization with a purpose. Revenge was clearly at the heart of it all, but for what? Hughes couldn't shake the feeling that this was bigger than Hargrave. The doctor had been a pawn in a much larger game. "I'll start by talking to his colleagues and family," Stephen said, rising from his chair. He needed to dig deeper, to find out who might have known too much about Hargrave's past and what he had been researching. But then something caught his eye. The bookshelf across the room was cluttered with medical journals, books on anatomy, and old case files, but buried under some loose papers, a thick ledger stood out. Its cover was worn, its pages yellowed with age. Hughes walked over and pulled it from the shelf, flipping through the pages. It wasn't filled with typical medical records or case notes. Instead, it appeared to be a detailed log of names, patients, dates, and cryptic notations written in a code Stephen didn't recognize. Some names were crossed out, while others had small symbols beside them, symbols that seemed oddly familiar, though he couldn't place them just yet. "What is this?" Hughes muttered, his heart pounding as he began scanning the pages more closely. He knew this ledger was significant, but what exactly was it tied to? Hargrave's secretive research? The mysterious group? Or perhaps something even darker? "Get me a list of Hargrave's most recent patients," Hughes said, turning back to Reynolds. "We need to know who might have been connected to him recently and who could have a motive." Reynolds nodded and left to begin gathering the information, but Hughes remained at his desk, his mind racing. The ledger was the key to unraveling the mystery, but what did the code mean? The names, the dates, was there a pattern hidden within them? He needed to decode this ledger, but where would he begin? As he thought about it, Hughes's mind drifted to the cryptic message. The faithful circle awaits. If this was indeed the group behind Hargrave's death, it meant something far bigger was at play, something Hughes was only beginning to uncover. The doctor hadn't just been a casualty of some petty conspiracy. Hargrave had been involved in something much deeper, and it was clear that the group behind it would stop at nothing to keep their secrets hidden. The puzzle was far from complete, but Hughes could feel the threads of the case beginning to pull tighter. His next move was clear. He had to find out more about Hargrave's patients, their connection to the enigmatic faithful circle, and why Dr. Andrew Hargrave's past had led him to such a tragic and untimely death. But there was one more thing Hughes needed to consider. If Hargrave had been involved in something so dangerous, then who else had been dragged into it? Was it possible that someone else would be targeted next? Hughes knew that to solve this case, he would need to tread carefully, for the path ahead was fraught with danger. The veil of deception had only just begun to lift. And there was no turning back. Stephen Hughes sat in his office, the quiet hum of the city just beyond the windows, an unwelcome contrast to the storm of thoughts swirling in his mind. He had followed the trail of clues, but each new revelation seemed to only deepen the mystery. Dr. Hargrave's past, his ties to the faithful circle, seemed to hold the key to understanding why the doctor had been targeted. But each new detail led to more questions. The most startling discovery came from the investigation into Hargrave's former patients. One name in particular stood out: William Weston. He had disappeared without a trace years ago, and what little was known about him suggested that his disappearance was tied to his involvement with the faithful circle. The religious group had a reputation for secrecy, fanaticism, and an obsession with divine judgment. Hargrave had treated Weston at one point, but the man's disappearance remained a mystery. Was it merely coincidence, or did it have something to do with the doctor's own tragic end? Stephen sat back in his chair, his mind working over the new information. Weston's connection to the faithful circle felt like a thread too important to ignore. The group had always been shrouded in rumors, tales of mysterious disappearances, cryptic ceremonies, and whispered promises of vengeance. It was a group whose members were said to be obsessed with judgment, with the idea that those who defied them could never escape retribution. But there was something else lurking beneath the surface, something that had drawn Hargrave into their fold before he had apparently broken free. Several of Hargrave's colleagues confirmed that the doctor had once been a member of the faithful circle, but that he had left the group under unusual circumstances. No one seemed to know why he had left, only that it had caused a rift between him and the group. It was as if leaving had been more than a simple departure. It had been a betrayal, a transgression that could not be forgiven. And that was where the mystery deepened. Why had Hargrave chosen to leave the faithful circle? Was it simply a matter of conscience, or had he discovered something about the group that made him fearful for his life? And had his departure triggered a chain of events that led to his death? The more Hughes dug into Hargrave's past, the more it became apparent that the faithful circle wasn't just a religious group. It was an organization with its own set of rules, beliefs, and punishments. And those who attempted to escape it rarely lived to tell the tale. Stephen's search for answers led him to Weston's final days, where he uncovered an old journal entry that sent a chill down his spine. The entry was dated just before Weston's disappearance and contained cryptic details about a dark ceremony, a ritual that had promised vengeance on those who had defied the faithful circle. But what caught Stephen's attention most was the name mentioned in Weston's account: Judah. Who is Judah? Hughes murmured aloud, his voice barely a whisper in the quiet of the office. The name felt significant, yet elusive. It wasn't just a name, it was a title, a figure who seemed to hold a position of power within the group. But who was Judah, and what role did he play in Hargrave's death? Stephen quickly jotted down the name, knowing it was the key to unlocking the final piece of the puzzle. Judah was clearly connected to the vengeance promised in Weston's journal, and if he was involved in Hargrave's murder, then the stakes were much higher than anyone had realized. This wasn't just a case of personal revenge, it was a carefully orchestrated plan, one that had been set in motion long before Hargrave's death. He stared at the journal entry for a moment longer, taking in the cryptic details of the ceremony and the ominous tone of Weston's final words. Whoever Judah was, he was clearly someone who commanded great influence within the faithful circle. It was also clear that Hargrave's past with the group had left a deep scar, one that could never be healed. Stephen sat up straighter, his thoughts racing. If Hargrave had been killed for his involvement with the faithful circle, then this case was no longer just about solving a murder. It was about stopping a dangerous cult from continuing its reign of terror. But to do that, Hughes needed to uncover everything about Judah, the leader of this mysterious faction, and find out what he wanted from Hargrave in the first place. But with each passing hour, the danger to Stephen grew. The deeper he delved into the group's secrets, the more likely it became that he, too, would become a target. Hargrave had tried to escape, and now he was dead. What had happened to Weston? And if Judah was real, what would happen to Stephen when he uncovered the truth? The clock was ticking, and Stephen knew that every moment brought him closer to a revelation that would either save him or end his investigation in a way far darker than he could imagine. The search for Judah had only just begun. The city was cloaked in an oppressive fog as Stephen Hughes made his way through the abandoned chapel on the outskirts of town. His every step echoed through the hollow space, a reminder that the final confrontation was at hand. The final pieces of the puzzle had clicked together: Dr. Hargrave's death, Jacob Price's murder, the twisted beliefs of the faithful circle. But there was one more piece to the puzzle: Judah, the enigmatic leader of the fanatical group, who had been orchestrating these killings from the shadows. Hughes had prepared himself for this moment. He had gathered all the evidence, the journals, the coded messages, the confessions from former members of the faithful circle. Everything had led him here, to this moment, where he would face Judah and end the deadly influence of the group once and for all. The chapel was desolate, its wooden pews long abandoned and the altar covered in dust. The once sacred space now felt like a stage for a grim ritual, the kind of place where secrets and sins were buried, hidden from the world. The air was thick with the weight of history, of countless lives ruined by fanaticism and blind devotion. Then, from the shadows at the altar, a figure emerged. Judah. He was older than Stephen had expected, his face gaunt and weathered, his eyes burning with a dangerous intensity. He was tall, his presence commanding the space around him. Despite the years that had worn on him, there was a certain power in the way he moved, a confidence that belied the madness in his eyes. "You think you can stop us?" Judah's voice was cold, laced with contempt. He took a step forward, his gaze never leaving Stephen's. "We are the reckoning of this world, the ones who will purge the filth. Your time is coming, Hughes." Stephen remained silent, his heart steady. This was the moment he had been preparing for. The moment when all the twisted truths, the secrets, the lies would come to an end. The murder of Dr. Hargrave had been a warning, a message sent by a group willing to go to any length to protect their ideology. But now, Stephen was the one who would send a message. With deliberate calm, Stephen reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the evidence he had gathered. The journals, The names. The detailed records of the faithful circle's rituals and murders. The confessions from Price and others who had dared to speak out. "It's over," Hughes said, his voice cutting through the tension in the room. "You're done." Judah's smirk faltered, just for a moment. The fanatical fire in his eyes flickered, replaced by something darker, a realization that his carefully constructed world was crumbling. Stephen continued, "You're not the reckoning of this world. You're a dying relic of a misguided cause. And today, your reign of terror ends." The shadows in the chapel seemed to grow deeper, as if the very walls were closing in on Judah. He stepped back, his face contorting with anger. "You think you've won? You're nothing but a fool, Hughes. We will rise again, and there's nothing you can do to stop us." But Stephen's words rang true. He had already secured the evidence he needed, and the authorities were on their way. The rest of Judah's followers would be arrested, their dangerous ideology unraveled piece by piece. The cult's network was extensive, but with this final confrontation, the group's power was all but gone. As if on cue, the distant sound of sirens began to fill the air. Judah's eyes widened in realization. The police were here. His empire was collapsing. His cult, his followers, his reign of terror, it was all coming to an end. Judah turned to flee, but before he could take a single step, Stephen stepped forward and blocked his path. The moment of reckoning had come. There was no escape. Within moments, the authorities arrived at the chapel, securing Judah and the remaining members of the faithful circle. The cult's operations were dismantled, their secrets exposed for all to see. What had started as a quiet investigation into a doctor's mysterious death had turned into a full-scale operation to bring down a dangerous, fanatical organization. As the police cuffed Judah and his followers, Stephen stood silently in the back of the chapel, watching the scene unfold. He could feel the weight of the case lifting from his shoulders. Hargrave's death had been tragic, but it had been a catalyst, a spark that ignited the unraveling of one of the city's most dangerous conspiracies. Dr. Hargrave's death, Jacob Price's murder, the hidden rituals of the faithful circle, they had all been part of a larger plan to conceal the truth. But now, that truth was exposed, and the cult's twisted grip on the city had been broken. The final pieces had fallen into place. For Stephen Raul Hughes, this case was over. But the shadow of the faithful circle's influence would linger in his mind, a constant reminder of how easily belief could be twisted into something far more sinister. And though he had solved the case, Stephen couldn't shake the feeling that there were still more shadows to uncover, more mysteries to unravel, more pieces of a much larger puzzle. For Hughes, the work was never truly finished. Case 10, The Lost Souls. The relentless rain pounded the streets, an unyielding cascade of water that drenched the city in a cold, oppressive mist. The gray fog crept along the sidewalks, clinging to the asphalt as though it were alive, devouring all warmth and color. Stephen Raul Hughes stood at the entrance of a decrepit office building, staring up at the flickering neon sign that hung above the door. Gable and Sons, the name boldly spelled out in jagged, neon red letters, seemed almost out of place in the midst of the dilapidation surrounding it. What should have been a pillar of prosperity was now a facade, its age-old reputation as one of the city's most reputable businesses barely masking the darker truths that lay hidden behind its doors. Hughes adjusted his collar against the chill and pushed open the door, the rusty hinges groaning in protest. His footsteps echoed down the narrow hallway, a hollow sound that seemed to reverberate through the building's long, empty corridors. The air inside smelled of stale coffee, old paper, and dust, memories of a time when the office had been alive with the hum of business and the click of typewriters. He was here for a reason. Lionel Gable had been a man of many connections, weaving through the city's elite circles with ease, yet his untimely death had raised more questions than answers. The official report said it was a suicide too clean, too convenient, Hughes thought. There were no signs of struggle, no notes left behind, but something about the whole situation didn't sit right with him. The shadows in Gable's life were deeper than anyone had realized. Hughes had been called in for a reason, to find the truth, no matter how twisted or dangerous it might be. And there was one person who might hold the key to unraveling the mystery. As Hughes walked further into the building, he was greeted by the sound of muffled voices coming from a room at the end of the hallway. When Hughes entered, the room fell silent. Behind a cluttered desk sat a man, his face gaunt and pale, his disheveled appearance giving him an air of perpetual discomfort. His hands were trembling as they fidgeted with a half-empty cup of coffee. His eyes, darting back and forth, betrayed his unease. This was Miles Carrington, the last person to have seen Gable alive. Carrington was a private investigator, a man once connected to Gable's inner circle, but now a fractured figure haunted by his own demons. And he had a peculiar condition, Tourette's syndrome. Mr. Carrington, Hughes began, his voice calm but purposeful as he took a seat opposite him. I understand you were the last to see Mr. Gable before he died. Carrington blinked, his hands trembling more violently now. He nodded, his mouth moving in erratic bursts as his words were punctuated by sharp, sudden outbursts. Yeah, that's right. I saw him. Before it happened. But it wasn't what you think. It wasn't a normal conversation, you know? Something was off, something was wrong. He was wrong. Hughes kept his voice steady, trying to pull something concrete from the jumbled mess of Carrington's words. What do you mean by wrong? Can you tell me what happened? Carrington's gaze flickered nervously to the window, his eyes tracing the raindrops racing down the glass. Gable wasn't the type. He wasn't a suicidal man. Not at all. He had enemies, sure, but he was too proud, too full of himself to end his life like that. No. I know how that man thought. He had too much left to do. Carrington's words came faster now, his eyes darting back to Hughes with a sudden urgency. He said something before it all went south. Something that didn't make sense. He said, find it, before it's too late. Carrington's voice trailed off as he repeated the words under his breath, almost as if he were trying to make sense of them himself. Hughes leaned forward slightly, his gaze never leaving Carrington's twitching form. What did he mean by that? What was he referring to? Carrington's expression twisted with frustration, his hands clenched tightly around the edges of his coffee cup. I don't know. He just kept talking about something hidden. Something important. But he wouldn't say what it was. It was like he was scared, like he couldn't say it outright. It's all a blur now, but I know it was there. And then he said it, he said before it's too late. And that's when I knew. I knew something was wrong. Hughes sat back in his chair, taking in Carrington's disjointed, almost manic words. There was a clue here, buried beneath the incoherence. Gable had been hiding something a secret, something that had terrified him enough to reach out to Carrington at the very end. But what? What did you do after he said that?" Hughes asked, his voice measured, trying to anchor the conversation to something solid. Carrington rubbed his face with both hands, his breath hitching. I tried to follow him, but I lost track. By the time I made it to his office, it was too late. The door was locked. I tried to get in, but someone must have been waiting for him. I couldn't get in. There it was, the first real piece of the puzzle. Carrington had been unable to follow through, but Hughes had the advantage of a clear head and an experienced eye. There were far too many loose ends to write this off as a suicide. Gable's cryptic warning, his fear of something hidden, and the suddenness of his death all pointed to a larger, more sinister force at play. Hughes stood up, his eyes scanning the room one last time. "I'll need access to Gable's office. And I want a list of his recent associates and business dealings. Everything you know." This was no random act. Carrington nodded, his eyes wide, as though coming to terms with the gravity of the situation. "You're not the only one looking into this," he muttered, his voice barely audible. There are others who want to find what's hidden. They'll stop at nothing to make sure no one gets their hands on it." Hughes gave him a cold, unreadable look. "That's exactly why I'm here." He turned toward the door, the weight of the case settling heavily on his shoulders. The rain still beat against the windows, a constant reminder of the storm that was just beginning. And as he stepped into the hallway, Hughes couldn't shake the feeling that this case would take him down a path that would lead to something much darker than a simple suicide. The real question now was, what had Lionel Gable known that was worth killing for? Stephen Raul Hughes stood at the threshold of Gable's office, his gaze sweeping the cluttered room. It was a study in contradictions. On the surface, it appeared orderly shelves of well-bound books, framed certificates of achievement on the walls, and a polished mahogany desk that gleamed under the dim light filtering through the rain-streaked windows. Yet, beneath this veneer of success, there was a palpable disorder. Papers and files were strewn across the desk haphazardly, some partially opened, others pushed to the side as if abandoned in haste. The faint scent of cigars lingered in the air, mingling with the musty odor of old leather details that painted a picture of a man who had lived a life of complexity, secrets, and shadows. Hughes stepped inside, his polished shoes clicking against the wooden floor. He didn't believe in coincidences. Everything in this room, every misplaced item or forgotten file, could potentially hold a clue. He ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing with the implications of what Carrington had said. Something was hidden here, something important enough to warrant a man's death. He began his search with methodical precision, sifting through the papers on the desk, each one representing a fragment of Gable's life. Some were innocuous, others more telling. Contracts, business proposals, old bank statements. But nothing stood out, nothing pointed directly to a motive for Gable's death, nor did it reveal anything that explained the cryptic last words Carrington had shared. It wasn't until Hughes opened the bottom drawer of the desk that he found something truly intriguing. Buried beneath a pile of loose papers, there was a manila folder slightly yellowed with age, its edges frayed as if it had been handled many times. Hughes pulled it out, his fingers brushing against the paper, and opened it slowly. Inside, the folder contained records, dozens of them detailing a series of shady business dealings that connected Gable to a network of dubious characters. At first glance, they seemed like nothing more than the usual corporate corruption, fraudulent transactions, money laundering, and shell companies designed to obscure the true nature of the dealings. But as Hughes read on, a particular name stood out, Franklin Z. The name appeared repeatedly, each time in association with large sums of money and illicit ventures. Franklin Z. wasn't just a minor player in Gable's business, he was the architect behind several of the most questionable deals. Hughes made a mental note to look further into this Franklin Z., but what truly caught his attention was something far more personal. At the back of the folder was a single, torn photograph. The image was of a woman, her face partially obscured by shadows. She had long, dark hair, and her expression was serious, unmistakably intense. It was a striking photograph, but it was the words scrawled across the bottom that sent a shiver down Hughes' spine. "She knows. Find her." The words felt like a final, desperate plea. It was as though Gable, in his last moments, had known exactly what needed to be uncovered and who held the key to unraveling the mystery. The woman's identity was a puzzle, but the phrase was unmistakable. Someone, somewhere, held knowledge that could shatter everything. Hughes stared at the photograph, the message burning into his memory. He needed to find her. Turning back to the desk, Hughes scanned the files again, searching for anything that might hint at the woman's identity. But there was nothing. No name, no address, no clue as to where to begin the search. The picture alone wasn't enough. It was a breadcrumb, but there was no clear path to follow. Hughes knew better than to rush into anything without gathering more information. The key to this case, he realized, lay not just in Gable's shady business dealings but in the people connected to him, the ones who might know the woman in the photograph and the meaning behind her cryptic message. Hughes stood up, tucking the photograph and the file carefully into his coat pocket. He would need to track down Franklin Z. and anyone else who had dealings with Gable, but the photograph would be his first priority. It could be the only lead he had to finding the woman who knew something dangerous, something worth dying for. As Hughes left Gable's office, the rain continued to fall in sheets, the world outside a blur of gray and black. The mystery was far from solved, but now, at least, he had a new thread to follow. A woman, a name, and a message. It was all he had, but it was a start. And for Hughes, a start was all he ever needed. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, but the night still carried a damp chill as Stephen Raul Hughes made his way through the narrow streets of the city. The name on the photograph, the woman with the haunting gaze, had led him to a dead end of forgotten histories, but a single thread had pulled him forward: Esther Crowley. Once a promising politician, she had disappeared from the public eye years ago, leaving behind a trail of whispers, rumors, and scandal. Now, Hughes stood on the threshold of her past, hoping that she might hold the final piece of the puzzle. He arrived at a dilapidated apartment building on the edge of town, its facade crumbling, the flickering streetlights casting an eerie glow over the graffiti-scarred walls. The building smelled of mildew and neglect, a stark contrast to the once vibrant life Esther had surely led. Hughes couldn't help but feel a sense of foreboding as he ascended the creaking stairs, each step echoing in the hollow silence of the place. He reached the door of her apartment, a nondescript, wooden entryway, the kind you would pass by without a second glance. Hughes raised his hand to knock, but before he could, the door creaked open, revealing the woman who had once been a rising star in the city's political world. Esther Crowley stood before him, her posture stiff, her face lined with age and hardship. Her once vibrant eyes, which had surely captivated crowds in the past, were now dull and guarded, as though the years of obscurity and secrecy had stripped her of all hope. But despite the weight of time on her features, there was something captivating about her, a faded beauty that seemed to have withstood the harshest trials of life. "You're looking for answers about Lionel Gable," she said, her voice low, almost resigned, as though she had been expecting him. Hughes studied her carefully, sensing that she knew more than she was letting on. His eyes narrowed slightly. "How do you know that?" Esther's lips parted in a faint, hollow smile. "Because I'm the one who tried to stop him," she replied quietly. "And now it's too late." The words hung in the air like a weight, but Hughes didn't flinch. His mind raced, trying to process the implications. Gable's death had been a mystery wrapped in layers of secrecy, and now Esther claimed to have had a hand in stopping him. Stopping him from what? And why had she disappeared? Hughes took a deep breath, forcing himself to focus. What happened? What is this about? Esther hesitated, her gaze drifting toward the dark corners of the apartment. Then, without a word, she stepped aside and gestured for him to enter. Hughes walked past her into the dimly lit room, the air thick with the smell of dust and old paper. The apartment was cluttered. Papers, files, and photographs covered nearly every surface, as though someone had been trying to piece together a puzzle for years. Newspaper clippings were pinned to the walls, each one connected to the next by fraying string. Scribbled notes, hastily written and crossed out, were scattered among the chaos. It was clear that Esther had been obsessively following something for a long time. The walls of the apartment, once likely adorned with political posters or pictures of family, now resembled the personal archive of a woman who had spent years digging into secrets that had consumed her. Hughes glanced around, taking in the disarray. His eyes landed on a series of photographs pinned to the wall, some familiar and some not. Among them was a picture of Lionel Gable, his face sharp and confident. But what struck Hughes the most was the woman from the photograph he had found in Gable's office. Her image was plastered on the wall as well, her face peering out from behind a veil of shadows, just like the first photograph he'd seen. Esther followed his gaze, her eyes distant as she spoke. "I tried to stop him before it went too far. Gable was involved in things that no one should ever know about, things that could destroy everything he built. He thought he was untouchable." Her voice faltered for a moment, but she steadied herself. "But he underestimated me." Hughes raised an eyebrow. "You tried to stop him? What exactly was he doing?" Esther's hands trembled as she picked up a file from the nearby table. She opened it slowly, revealing a stack of documents, all linked to shady dealings and corruption. As Hughes flipped through the pages, he saw a pattern emerge: transactions, bribes, and illegal contracts that stretched from the highest levels of the political world to the murky depths of the city's criminal underworld. He was getting too close to something, too close to a secret that could ruin everything, Esther continued. "But when I tried to expose him, Gable retaliated. He wanted control, and I was standing in his way." Stephen leaned in closer, studying the documents. "What secret? What was he after?" Esther's voice dropped to a whisper. "It's not just about money or power, Hughes. There's a much darker truth. Something that involves Gable, Franklin Z, and people in high places. And now, that truth is coming back to haunt me." Hughes's mind began to race, the puzzle pieces clicking into place. The connections between Gable, Franklin Z, and now Esther were growing clearer, but there was still one thing that eluded him: the woman in the photograph. The one who knew too much. "What do you mean by coming back to haunt you?" Hughes asked, his tone sharp. "What aren't you telling me?" Esther looked at him for a long moment, her eyes weary but determined. "The truth is dangerous, Stephen. And once you find it, you can never turn back. For the first time, Hughes felt a chill run down his spine. Esther Crowley had spent years hiding, but now, she was ready to reveal the truth. It was a truth that would change everything. The rain had stopped, but the chill lingered in the air as Stephen Raul Hughes listened intently to Esther Crowley's confession. The more she spoke, the more the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. What had started as a case of a man's mysterious death had evolved into something far more sinister, tangled in webs of betrayal, power, and secrets that stretched deep into the city's criminal underbelly. Esther's eyes were red-rimmed, her hands trembling as she recounted the past. The woman who had once held such promise in the city's political scene now seemed like a shadow of her former self, a woman weighed down by the knowledge of the corruption and danger that had consumed her life. "I was involved with Franklin Z. once," Esther said, her voice quiet, almost a whisper. "He was charming, powerful, everything I thought I wanted. But I didn't know the full extent of what he was into until it was too late." Hughes watched her closely, noting the way her gaze shifted uneasily, as if she were revisiting a time she had long buried. Franklin Z had been a name that had come up several times in the investigation, a figure who remained as elusive as the deals he orchestrated. He was a man whose reputation for criminal enterprise ran deep, but no one had ever managed to pin him down. Esther continued, her voice thick with regret. "When I realized what he was really doing, I tried to warn Gable. He had gotten involved with Z, two working together on some shady deals, moving money, laundering assets, but it wasn't just about money. It was bigger than that. Z had his hands in everything: business, politics, crime. He pulled all the strings behind the scenes." Hughes leaned forward, his mind racing as the web of corruption began to take shape. He knew Gable had been connected to shady deals, but he hadn't suspected the involvement of a man like Franklin Z, or that the two had been part of something much larger. "What did you warn Gable about?" Hughes asked, his voice steady but filled with urgency. "What exactly were they up to?" Esther hesitated, clearly weighing her words carefully. Z, Gable, and a few others. There was an underworld figure pulling the strings. Someone powerful. Someone no one could touch. They were all working for him, moving money, manipulating people, making sure the city's most powerful stayed in control. But Gable, he was different. He started to get cold feet. He realized just how deep the corruption went, how many lives were ruined by their actions. And he decided he was going to expose everything. He was going to blow the whole operation wide open. Hughes could feel his blood run cold. "And that's why he was killed," he said, piecing it together. "Someone silenced him to protect the operation." Esther nodded, her face pale. "Yes. But it wasn't just that. Gable had something on me, something I never wanted anyone to know. When we were involved, he kept evidence of everything, including my past with Z. He threatened to expose it all if I didn't keep quiet. But when he started talking about exposing the operation, he made it clear that I would be implicated too. He was going to make sure I paid for everything. He thought I had betrayed him. That's when I realized he wasn't just going to expose Z. He was going to ruin me too." Stephen's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and theories. It all made sense now. Gable had been killed not only to stop him from blowing the lid off a massive criminal network, but also to protect those who had been complicit in it. But Gable hadn't just been a pawn. He'd been a threat that had to be eliminated, along with anyone who could bring the entire operation down. "Who is this underworld figure?" Hughes asked, his voice tight with intensity. "Who's the one pulling all the strings?" Esther shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "I don't know his name." "No one does. He's a ghost, a phantom who hides behind layers of protection. The people who work for him are too afraid to even whisper his name. But I know he's out there, and I know he's the reason Gable had to die. Gable had become a liability, someone who could ruin everything." Hughes remained silent for a moment, processing the enormity of what Esther had just revealed. This was no longer a simple case of murder, it was part of a larger conspiracy, one that involved the city's most powerful figures and a shadowy underworld figure pulling the strings from the darkness. "Is there anything else I need to know?" Hughes asked, his voice soft but insistent. Esther's face darkened, her gaze distant as she stared out the window. "One last thing," she said, her voice shaking with fear. "When Gable started to make his move, he was being watched. The people behind him, they knew he was going to turn on them. They knew he was going to try to take them down, and they couldn't let that happen. They had to act fast." Hughes took a deep breath, his mind working rapidly. Who did Gable trust? Who was on his side? Esther swallowed hard, looking as if she were reliving the worst moments of her life. "He trusted Miles Carrington, the private investigator you spoke with. But Carrington was compromised. He was too close to the people who wanted Gable silenced. He might have been the one who tipped them off." The revelation hit Hughes like a punch to the gut. Miles Carrington, the man who had witnessed Gable's final moments, the man who had seemed like a key witness, he might have been part of the conspiracy all along. Hughes's instincts had been right. There was more to Carrington than met the eye. Hughes stood up, his mind racing as he processed everything Esther had revealed. The pieces were falling into place, but there were still too many questions left unanswered. He had to find out who was behind this web of corruption and bring them to justice before anyone else was silenced. But there was one thing Hughes was sure of: the truth was out there, and it was darker than he could have ever imagined. The rain had started up again, drenching the streets in a relentless downpour as Stephen Raul Hughes made his way through the dimly lit alley. The city was a labyrinth of shadows, its towering buildings looming like silent sentinels, bearing witness to countless secrets. This time, though, Hughes had the truth within his grasp. After weeks of relentless investigation, chasing down clues, and piecing together the web of lies that had concealed the real cause of Lionel Gable's death, Hughes was finally face to face with the man responsible for it all, Franklin Z. Z was a figure shrouded in mystery, a name whispered in dark corners of the city's underworld but never spoken aloud in the light. His reputation for slipping through the cracks, for manipulating everyone around him, had made him untouchable. Until now. The alley was silent except for the sound of raindrops hitting the pavement. Hughes stood there, staring at the man who had been the mastermind behind the conspiracy that had cost Gable his life. Z leaned casually against the wall, his hands in his pockets, his face a mask of calm indifference. He had no reason to fear Hughes, not yet. "You're late, Hughes," Z said, his voice smooth and mocking, as if he had all the time in the world. "I thought you'd be quicker. A man like you, sharp as you are, should have seen this coming." Hughes remained silent for a moment, studying the man before him. Z was everything Hughes had imagined: charming, calculating, and utterly without remorse. But Hughes had the one thing Z couldn't manipulate: the truth. "I know what you've done," Hughes said finally, his voice steady. "I know about the deals, the corruption, the murders. I know about Gable's betrayal, about Esther Crowley, and about your little empire. It's over, Z. The game's up. Z's smirk never wavered. Is it? He replied, almost too casually. You think you've won, but you've only uncovered the tip of the iceberg. What I've built is far bigger than you can imagine. This city runs on secrets, Hughes. You can expose one, but you'll never get to the heart of it. Hughes took a step forward, the weight of the case pressing down on him. It doesn't matter anymore, he said. You're done. Z's expression darkened for the first time, the arrogance in his eyes fading, replaced by a flicker of something colder. You think you've beaten me? You've got nothing on me. I'll walk away from this. I always do. Before Hughes could respond, Z's hand shot out from his pocket, a gun gleaming in the dim light. But Stephen was faster. In one fluid motion, he drew his own weapon and pointed it directly at Z, his finger on the trigger, his heart pounding in his chest. Not this time, Hughes said, his voice unwavering. This time, it ends. Z's hand dropped, the gun falling to the wet ground with a soft clink. His face twisted in anger and disbelief, but there was no escape. Hughes had him cornered, and the evidence against him was undeniable. The sound of approaching sirens broke the tense silence, and Z's fate was sealed. He was arrested, his criminal empire crumbling as the weight of his actions caught up with him. The investigation that had started with one man's mysterious death had unraveled a network of lies, betrayals, and unspeakable acts that had gone unchecked for years. As Hughes watched Z being led away in handcuffs, he couldn't help but feel the weight of the case settle heavily on his shoulders. The truth had been uncovered, but it had come at a cost. Gable was dead, Esther had vanished into the shadows once more, and the people who had been caught in the web of Franklin Z's influence would never truly be free. For a moment, Hughes felt the sting of the darkness that lingered over the city, the realization that exposing the truth wasn't always a victory, it was sometimes a burden. The city would continue to hide its secrets, and though one man had been brought to justice, there would always be more shadows to chase. As Hughes turned away from the scene, the rain falling heavier now, he couldn't shake the feeling that this case, like so many others, was far from over. The truth might have been revealed, but in a city like this, the price of knowing the truth was often higher than anyone could afford. For Stephen Raul Hughes, it was just another case solved. But as he walked away, he couldn't help but feel the lingering unease in his chest. In the end, the truth wasn't just dangerous, it was a force that could consume anyone who dared to seek it.
The shadows have spoken, the lies are shattered, and yet not all justice is clean, not all redemption is painless. You've just completed Episode 2 of the Case Files of Detective S.R.H, written by me, only on Audible Archives. If these stories left a mark, like, comment, and subscribe. Case 11 is already waiting in the dark. And so, the tale draws to a close, but the echoes remain here in the Audible Archives. And until our next journey through shadow and story, keep listening, keep wondering, because every ending hides another beginning. Audible Archives, where stories never sleep.